Tides of Isle Dauphine by Sylvester Fourroux. Chapter 1. The Harbor at Dawn. The Gulf wind carried the scent of salt and pine across the harbor as Jean-Baptiste Mercier stood at the edge of the wooden wharf, watching the sun break over the eastern waters. The morning light painted Isle Dauphine in shades of amber and rose, illuminating the small collection of wooden buildings that comprised the capital of the Louisiana Territory. It was June of 1715, and the island settlement, though modest, represented France's ambitious foothold in this vast, untamed land. Jean-Baptiste adjusted his tricorn hat against the strengthening breeze and pulled his dark blue waistcoat closer. At 32, he had spent the last 5 years as a colonial officer and trader, navigating the complex relationships between the French crown, the settlers, and the native peoples who had inhabited these shores long before any European ship had appeared on the horizon. His sun-bronzed face bore the marks of a man who had learned to read the weather, the tides, and the intentions of other men with equal skill. Behind him, the settlement was beginning to stir. Smoke rose from chimneys as women prepared the morning meal. The governor's residence, the largest structure on the island, though still humble by European standards, stood prominently near the center of the settlement, its French flag hanging limp in the humid air. Around it clustered perhaps 40 other buildings, homes, warehouses, a small chapel, the barracks, and various workshops. The fortifications that protected the harbor were functional but straightforward wooden palisades reinforced with earth, mounting a dozen cannon that watched over the approaches. Jean-Baptiste's attention was drawn to movement in the harbor. 3 pirogues, the flat-bottomed boats essential to life in these waters, were being prepared for the journey to Mobile on the mainland. These vessels, adapted from native designs, could navigate the shallow coastal waters and bayous that would ground any proper ship. They were the lifeline connecting Isle Dauphine to the rest of the territory. "Monsieur Mercier," a voice called from behind him. He turned to see young Pierre Dubois, barely 18, hurrying down the sandy path from the settlement. The boy served as a runner for Governor Bienville and was always on the move. "The governor requests your presence," Pierre said, slightly breathless. "There is a matter of some urgency." Jean-Baptiste nodded and followed the young man back toward the governor's residence. As they walked, he observed the settlement's morning routines. Women in their linen shifts and petticoats hung washing on lines, their hair covered by simple caps. Men in shirt sleeves and breeches prepared fishing nets or tended to the small gardens that supplemented the settlement's precarious food supply. Children chased chickens between the buildings, their laughter a bright counterpoint to the constant underlying anxiety that characterized colonial life. The settlement lived perpetually on the edge of disaster. Hurricanes could sweep across the island with devastating force. Supply ships from France were irregular and often arrived with spoiled provisions. Yellow fever and malaria claimed lives every summer. The native tribes, while generally maintaining peaceful trade relations, could turn hostile if provoked or if alliances shifted. And always there was hunger, the gnawing uncertainty of whether the next ship would arrive before the stores ran empty. Governor Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne de Bienville received him in the main room of his residence, a space that served as both office and council chamber. The governor was a lean man in his late 30s, his face weathered by years in the colony. He wore a fine coat of burgundy wool, impractical in the heat, but necessary for maintaining the dignity of his office, and his dark hair was tied back in a queue. "Mercier," Bienville said without preamble. "We have a problem." Jean-Baptiste waited, accustomed to the governor's direct manner. "The supply inventory does not match the manifests from the last 3 ships," Bienville continued, spreading several documents across his desk. Flour, salt, pork, gunpowder, tools all significantly short of what was recorded as delivered. "Spoilage?" Jean-Baptiste suggested, though he already suspected otherwise. "That was my first thought. But the shortages are too consistent, too calculated. Someone is stealing from the common stores." The governor's expression was grim. "If this continues, we will not have sufficient provisions to survive the winter." let alone the hurricane season. Jean-Baptiste studied the documents. The discrepancies were indeed suspicious, consistently just below the threshold that would trigger immediate alarm, but accumulating to a significant total. Who has access to the warehouses? Claude Vachon, as supply master, naturally. His assistants, the warehouse guards, myself, and you, as my officer responsible for trade and procurement. Bienville met his eyes. I need you to investigate this quietly. If word spreads that our supplies are being stolen, it could cause panic. And if the thief is warned, he will cover his tracks. You suspect Vachon? I suspect everyone and no one. But Vachon, the governor paused. He lives well for a man on a supply master's salary. His home is better furnished than mine. He always seems to have wine when the rest of us are drinking water. Jean-Baptiste knew Claude Vachon by reputation and occasional interaction. The man was in his 40s, thick-bodied, and perpetually sweating in the Gulf heat. He had arrived in the colony 3 years ago with impeccable credentials from France, and he ran the supply operations with apparent efficiency. But there was something in his manner, an oily obsequiousness combined with calculating eyes that had always made Jean-Baptiste uneasy. I will look into it, Jean-Baptiste promised. Discreetly, Bienville emphasized. We cannot afford discord in the settlement. Not now. As Jean-Baptiste left the governor's residence, he nearly collided with a young woman carrying a basket of herbs. She stepped back gracefully, and he found himself looking into the most striking pair of green eyes he had ever seen. Pardon, mademoiselle, he said, removing his hat. The fault was mine, monsieur, she replied, her voice carrying the cultured accent of educated French. I was not watching where I walked. She was perhaps 23 or 24, with dark hair pinned up beneath a simple linen cap, though several curls had escaped to frame her face. Her dress was modest, a working gown of pale blue linen, with a white fichu tucked into the neckline, but it could not disguise the elegant lines of her figure. The stays beneath her bodice emphasized a slender waist, and the way she carried herself spoke of grace and confidence, despite the humble setting. You are Mademoiselle Rousseau, are you not? Jean-Baptiste asked, recognizing her now. The merchant's daughter? Geneviève Rousseau, she confirmed with a slight smile. And you are Monsieur Mercier, the governor's officer. My father speaks highly of you. Your father is generous in his assessment. My father is an excellent judge of character. Her eyes held a hint of amusement. He says you are one of the few honest men in the colony. Before Jean-Baptiste could respond, a voice called from a nearby house. Geneviève, the water is boiling. I must go, she said. We are preparing medicines. Madame Fontaine's fever has worsened. Yellow fever? Jean-Baptiste asked with concern. We fear so. The summer sickness has begun early this year. She adjusted her basket. Good day, Monsieur Mercier. He watched her walk away, noting the straight line of her back and the purposeful efficiency of her movements. Geneviève Rousseau. He had seen her before. Of course, the island was too small for anonymity, but had never spoken with her directly. Her father, Michel Rousseau, was a merchant who had arrived in the colony 5 years ago with his wife and daughter, establishing a small but successful trading operation. The family was well respected, known for their fairness and their willingness to help their neighbors. Jean-Baptiste found his thoughts returning to those green eyes as he made his way toward the warehouses. Chapter 2. Shadows in the Stores. The main warehouse stood near the harbor, a long wooden structure with a palmetto-thatched roof. 2 guards lounged in the shade of the entrance, straightening when they saw Jean-Baptiste approach. Monsieur Mercier, one acknowledged. I need to inspect the stores, Jean-Baptiste said casually. The governor wants a report on our current provisions. The guards exchanged glances but made no objection. Jean-Baptiste had the authority to enter, and such inspections were not unusual. Inside, the warehouse was dim and stifling, the air thick with the smell of dried fish, tar, and mildew. Barrels and crates were stacked along the walls, each marked with its contents and date of arrival. Jean-Baptiste moved slowly through the space, comparing the physical inventory to the manifest he had brought with him. The discrepancies were real. A barrel marked as containing 50 pounds of flour felt suspiciously light. A crate of tools was missing several items. The gunpowder stores were at least 20 pounds short of what the manifest indicated. Looking for something specific? Jean-Baptiste turned to find Claude Vachon standing in the doorway, his bulk silhouetted against the bright exterior. The supply master moved into the warehouse with surprising quietness for a man of his size. "Routine inspection," Jean-Baptiste replied evenly. "The governor likes to keep current records." Of course. Vachon's smile did not reach his eyes. "Though I provide him with weekly reports." "Surely those are sufficient?" "The governor values thoroughness." "As do I, Monsieur Mercier. As do I." Vachon moved closer, and Jean-Baptiste caught the smell of wine on his breath. Expensive wine, not the rough stuff most settlers drank. "You know, in my experience, men who go looking for problems usually find them, whether they exist or not." "Are you suggesting there are problems with the supplies, Monsieur Vachon?" "I am suggesting that in a settlement such as ours, with limited resources and difficult conditions, some shrinkage is inevitable. Spoilage, spillage, rats. One cannot expect perfection." "No," Jean-Baptiste agreed. "But one can expect honesty." Vachon's expression hardened for just a moment before the oily smile returned. "I have always been honest in my dealings, monsieur. My records are impeccable. If you find any discrepancies, I am certain there are reasonable explanations." "I am certain there are," Jean-Baptiste said. "Thank you for your cooperation, Monsieur Vachon." As he left the warehouse, Jean-Baptiste was more convinced than ever that the supply master was involved in the thefts. But conviction was not proof, and Vachon was clearly intelligent enough to have covered his tracks well. The afternoon heat was oppressive as Jean-Baptiste made his way through the settlement. He needed to think, to plan his next move. His path took him past the Rousseau home, a neat wooden structure with a small garden where herbs and vegetables grew in careful rows. Geneviève was in the garden, kneeling beside a bed of plants. She had removed her cap, and her dark hair fell in a thick braid down her back. The sleeves of her shift were rolled up, revealing slender forearms, and there was a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She looked up as his shadow fell across her, shading her eyes against the sun. "Monsieur Mercier," she said, "twice in one day. Are you following me?" He felt heat rise to his face that had nothing to do with the weather. "I was merely walking, mademoiselle. I did not mean to disturb you." "You are not disturbing me." She stood, brushing dirt from her petticoats. "I am gathering feverfew and willow bark. Madame Fontaine's condition has not improved." "I am sorry to hear it. Is there anything that can be done?" "We keep her cool, give her water and broth, and pray." Geneviève's expression was somber. "The summer sickness takes whom it will. We can only try to ease the suffering." "You have knowledge of healing?" "My mother taught me." She learned from her mother, who was known as a healer in Normandy. She gestured to the garden. "We grow what medicines we can here. The native peoples have also taught us much about the plants of this land." Jean-Baptiste found himself drawn into conversation, asking about the various herbs and their uses. Geneviève spoke with intelligence and passion, her hands moving expressively as she described the properties of different plants. He noticed the way the sunlight caught in her hair, the graceful curve of her neck, the animation in her face when she spoke of something that interested her. "You must think me very forward," she said suddenly, "speaking so freely to a man I barely know." "I think you are knowledgeable and passionate about your work," Jean-Baptiste replied. "Those are admirable qualities. My father says I should be more reserved, that men do not appreciate women who speak their minds. Then those men are fools." She looked at him with surprise, then smiled a genuine smile that transformed her face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. "You are kind to say so, Monsieur Mercier." "Jean-Baptiste," he said impulsively. "Please, call me Jean-Baptiste." "Then you must call me Geneviève." She held his gaze for a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed, and he felt something shift in his chest, a recognition, a possibility. Their conversation was interrupted by a shout from the harbor. Both turned to see a commotion near the warehouses. Jean-Baptiste excused himself and hurried toward the disturbance. A crowd had gathered around one of the warehouse guards, who was bleeding from a gash on his head. The other guard was explaining to anyone who would listen. We heard a noise inside, went to investigate. Someone was in there, moving things. When we challenged him, he struck Henri and fled. Did you see who it was? Jean-Baptiste demanded. Too dark, medium height, quick. He went toward the north end of the island. Jean-Baptiste organized a search party, but the thief had vanished into the scrub and marsh that covered much of the island's interior. By the time they gave up the search, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. That evening, Jean-Baptiste sat in his small quarters, a single room in the barracks, and considered what he knew. Someone was stealing supplies. That someone had been bold enough to return to the warehouse in daylight, and that someone had been willing to use violence to escape. The question was whether the thief was Vachon himself or someone working for him, and more importantly, what was being done with the stolen goods. Chapter 3. The Dance. The following Sunday, the settlement gathered for Mass in the small chapel, followed by a communal meal and dancing in the square. These gatherings were essential to maintaining morale in the isolated colony, providing a sense of community and normalcy in the midst of hardship. Jean-Baptiste attended, as was expected of a colonial officer. He wore his best coat, dark blue wool with brass buttons over a clean linen shirt and waistcoat. His breeches were brushed, his stockings white, his shoes polished. It was too hot for such formal attire, but appearances mattered. The chapel was crowded and stifling, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and tallow candles. Father Raphael, the settlement's priest, conducted the Mass in Latin, his voice rising and falling in the familiar rhythms. Jean-Baptiste's attention wandered, his eyes drawn to where the Rousseau family sat 3 rows ahead. Geneviève wore a gown of pale green linen that brought out the color of her eyes. Her hair was pinned up beneath a white cap, and a fine lace fichu covered her shoulders and the neckline of her bodice. Even in the dim light of the chapel, she seemed to glow with vitality. As if sensing his gaze, she turned her head slightly and met his eyes. A faint smile touched her lips before she returned her attention to the altar. After Mass, tables were set up in the square, and the women brought out what food could be spared: fish, stew, cornbread, greens from the gardens, and precious preserves from France. It was not a feast by European standards, but it was eaten with gratitude and shared with generosity. Jean-Baptiste found himself seated near the Rousseau family. Michel Rousseau was a man in his 50s, with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent years at sea before settling in the colony. His wife, Marguerite, was a handsome woman with the same dark hair and green eyes as her daughter. "Monsieur Mercier," Michel said warmly, "join us, please. There is always room for one more." As they ate, the conversation ranged over the settlement's concerns: the late supply ship, the summer sickness, the need for more laborers to help with the harvest. Jean-Baptiste was impressed by Michel's thoughtful observations and Marguerite's quiet wisdom, and he was increasingly aware of Geneviève's presence beside him, the occasional brush of her arm against his, the sound of her laugh. When the meal was finished and the tables cleared, a fiddler struck up a tune, and couples began to form for dancing. The contredanse was popular in the colony, its patterns familiar to anyone who had grown up in France. Jean-Baptiste found his courage and turned to Geneviève. "Would you honor me with a dance, mademoiselle?" "I would be delighted, monsieur." He led her to the dancing area, acutely aware of her hand in his. The dance brought them together and apart in the prescribed patterns, allowing for conversation during the brief moments when they were paired. "You dance well," Geneviève observed. "My mother insisted I learn, though I had little use for such skills in my previous life." "And what was your previous life?" "I was a soldier. I fought in the War of the Spanish Succession." "That must have been difficult." "It was necessary. But I am glad those days are behind me." They separated for a turn, then came back together. And you? How did you come to the colony? My father's business in France was failing. He heard that Louisiana needed merchants, that there were opportunities here for those willing to take the risk. She smiled ruefully. I do not think any of us understood quite how primitive the conditions would be. Do you regret coming? She considered the question as they moved through the pattern. No, life here is hard, but it is also honest. In France, everything was about appearances, about maintaining one's position. Here, we survive or fail based on our own efforts and the help of our neighbors. There is something pure about that. The dance ended, but Jean-Baptiste was reluctant to release her hand. Would you walk with me? He asked impulsively. The evening is pleasant. She glanced at her parents, who were deep in conversation with another couple. A brief walk would be acceptable. They strolled toward the harbor, where the setting sun painted the water in shades of orange and purple. The sounds of the celebration faded behind them, replaced by the gentle lap of waves and the cry of seabirds. I must confess something, Geneviève said. I have noticed you before, Monsieur Mercier, Jean-Baptiste. Have you? You are not like the other men in the settlement. You do not boast or swagger. You listen more than you speak. You treat everyone with respect, regardless of their station. She paused. These are rare qualities. You give me too much credit. I do not think so. She stopped walking and turned to face him. The evening light caught in her eyes, and he was struck again by her beauty, not just the physical beauty of her features, but something more profound, a strength and intelligence that shone through. Geneviève, he said, and found he had no words for what he wanted to say. She stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the lavender she used to scent her clothes. Yes? He reached up and gently touched her cheek, giving her every opportunity to step away. She did not. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. I should not, he murmured. Why not? I have nothing to offer you. I am a soldier turned trader, living in a barracks, with no prospects beyond my salary. I do not care about prospects. Her voice was soft but firm. I care about character, about honor, about the kind of man who would investigate theft to protect his community, who would speak respectfully to a woman who grows herbs in the dirt. How did you know about the investigation? This is a small island, Jean-Baptiste. Everyone knows everything. She smiled. Be careful. Claude Vachon is a dangerous man. Before he could respond, she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his a brief, sweet kiss that sent fire through his veins. Then she stepped back, her cheeks flushed. I should return to my parents, she said, but I hope you will call on us soon, properly. He watched her walk back toward the square, his heart pounding. He had kissed women before, had even fancied himself in love once or twice. But this felt different. This felt like standing on the edge of something vast, terrifying, and wonderful. Chapter 4. The Trap. Jean-Baptiste spent the next several days carefully observing the warehouse operations and Claude Vachon's movements. He noted that Vachon often left the settlement in the evening, claiming to be checking on the fishing operations or meeting with native traders. But the timing was suspicious, and Jean-Baptiste decided to follow him. On a humid evening in late June, Jean-Baptiste watched from concealment as Vachon left his house and made his way north along the beach. The supply master moved with purpose, occasionally glancing behind him to ensure he was not followed. Jean-Baptiste kept his distance, using the scrub and dunes for cover. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the sand. Vachon walked for perhaps half a mile before turning inland, following a barely visible path through the marsh grass. The path led to a small clearing where a crude shelter had been constructed from driftwood and palmetto fronds. Inside, Jean-Baptiste could see stacks of barrels and crates of supplies that should have been in the settlement's warehouses. Vachon was not alone. 2 other men were there, both rough-looking individuals that Jean-Baptiste recognized as sailors from one of the trading vessels that occasionally visited the island. They were loading supplies into a pirogue pulled up on the muddy bank of a tidal creek. Jean-Baptiste crept closer, straining to hear their conversation. Next ship arrives in 2 weeks, Vachon was saying. We'll have another load ready by then. The captain in Mobile pays well for French supplies, no questions asked. What about the governor's man? One of the sailors asked. Word is he's been nosing around. Mercier? Vachon spat. He suspects, but he has no proof, and he won't find any. We've been too careful. Maybe we should deal with him. Accidents happen in the colony. No. Vachon's voice was sharp. That would draw too much attention. We need to be patient. Another few months, and we'll have enough to leave this miserable place and live well in Mobile or New Orleans. Jean-Baptiste had heard enough. He began to back away carefully, intending to return to the settlement and report to the governor. But his foot came down on a dry branch, and the crack echoed through the clearing like a gunshot. "Someone's there!" one of the sailors shouted. Jean-Baptiste ran, crashing through the marsh grass toward the beach. Behind him, he could hear pursuit. He was in good condition, but the sailors were younger and knew the terrain. They were gaining on him. He burst out onto the beach and ran toward the settlement, his lungs burning. The lights of the houses were visible in the distance, but they seemed impossibly far away. His pursuers were close now, close enough that he could hear their breathing. A shot rang out, and sand kicked up near his feet. They were armed. Jean-Baptiste zigzagged, making himself a more challenging target. Another shot, and this one came closer. He could now see figures ahead, people from the settlement drawn by the sound of gunfire. "Help!" he shouted. "Thieves!" His pursuers broke off, melting back into the darkness. Jean-Baptiste stumbled to a stop, hands on his knees, gasping for breath. A group of men surrounded him, including Governor Bienville. "What happened?" the governor demanded. Between breaths, Jean-Baptiste explained what he had discovered. Bienville's face grew darker with each word. "We go now," the governor said. "Arm yourselves." Within minutes, a party of 20 men was moving up the beach, carrying muskets and torches. But when they reached the clearing, it was empty. The supplies were gone. The pirogue vanished. Only the crude shelter remained as evidence that anything had been there. "They had time to move everything," Jean-Baptiste said bitterly. "I should have come for help immediately." "You would not have made it back alive," Bienville replied. "They would have killed you in the marsh and hidden your body. At least now we know the truth. But we still have no proof that will stand up in a court. Then we will have to be clever." The governor's expression was grim. "Vachon does not know that we know about his operation. We can use that." They returned to the settlement, where Bienville called an emergency council meeting. Jean-Baptiste was surprised to see Michel Rousseau among those summoned, apparently. The merchant was a trusted advisor to the governor. The council met in Bienville's residence, the room lit by candles that cast flickering shadows on the walls. Besides the governor, Jean-Baptiste, and Michel, there were 3: Father Raphael, the settlement's priest, Captain Dumont, commander of the garrison, and Monsieur Leblanc, the settlement's senior clerk. Bienville explained the situation, and the council discussed options. It was Michel who suggested the plan that they ultimately adopted. "Vachon believes he is safe," Michel said. "He thinks Mercier has no proof. So we give him an opportunity he cannot resist, a large shipment of valuable supplies, poorly guarded. We let him steal it, and we catch him in the act." "It is risky," Captain Dumont observed. "If something goes wrong, we lose supplies we can ill afford to spare. If we do nothing, we lose them anyway," Michel countered. "At least this way, we have a chance to end the theft and recover what has been stolen." The council agreed. They would stage a false shipment, make it appear that a large quantity of valuable supplies, gunpowder, tools, and preserved food had arrived and been carelessly stored. Then they would watch and wait for Vachon to take the bait. As the meeting broke up, Michel drew Jean-Baptiste aside. "My daughter speaks highly of you," the merchant said quietly. Jean-Baptiste felt his face grow warm. "Mademoiselle Rousseau is very kind. She is also very perceptive and very dear to me." Michel's expression was serious. "I would not want to see her hurt." "Neither would I, monsieur. I assure you, my intentions are honorable. I believe you, but these are dangerous times, and you are about to do a dangerous thing. Be careful, Jean-Baptiste, for all our sakes. Chapter 5. The Summer Sickness. The trap was set, but before it could be sprung, disaster struck the settlement. The summer sickness that had claimed Madame Fontaine spread rapidly through the community. Within a week, a dozen people were ill with yellow fever, their skin taking on the characteristic yellowish tinge, their bodies racked with fever and pain. The settlement's small infirmary was overwhelmed. Geneviève and her mother worked tirelessly, moving from house to house, tending to the sick. Jean-Baptiste saw her only in passing, her face drawn with exhaustion, her dress stained with sweat and worse. The death toll mounted. Madame Fontaine died, followed by 2 children and an elderly man. The settlement was gripped by fear. Some wanted to flee to the mainland, but Governor Bienville forbade it, knowing that the sickness would only spread to Mobile if they did. Jean-Baptiste threw himself into helping however he could, fetching water, digging graves, sitting with the sick so their families could rest. The investigation of Vachon's theft seemed almost trivial in the face of such suffering. It was during this dark time that he truly came to know Geneviève. He watched her move among the sick with tireless compassion, never flinching from even the most unpleasant tasks. She held the hands of the dying, sang to feverish children, and somehow found words of comfort for grieving families. One evening, he found her sitting alone on the beach, staring out at the water. She looked utterly spent, her shoulders slumped, her cap askew. "Geneviève," he said softly, sitting beside her. She turned to him, and he was shocked to see tears on her cheeks. "I cannot save them," she whispered. "I try and try, but they keep dying." He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned against him, her body shaking with silent sobs. They sat like that for a long time, watching the sun set over the gulf, drawing comfort from each other's presence. "You are doing everything humanly possible," Jean-Baptiste said finally. "No one could do more. It does not feel like enough. I know, but you are giving them dignity and comfort in their final hours. That is not nothing." She lifted her head and looked at him, her eyes red from crying. "How do you stay so strong?" "I am not strong. I am terrified. But I have learned that sometimes all we can do is keep moving forward, keep doing the next thing that needs to be done." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his cheek. "I am glad you are here, Jean-Baptiste." He turned his head and kissed her palm, a gesture of tenderness and promise. "I am not going anywhere." The epidemic lasted 3 weeks. By the time it finally burned itself out, 15 people had died, a devastating loss for a settlement of fewer than 200 souls. The survivors were exhausted, grieving, and frightened. But they were also resilient. Slowly, life began to return to normal. Gardens were tended, fishing resumed, and children played again in the square. The settlement had survived, enduring hurricanes, supply shortages, and all the other hardships of colonial life. And through it all, Jean-Baptiste and Geneviève had grown closer. They had seen each other at their worst, exhausted, frightened, covered in filth, and had not turned away. They had worked side by side, supporting each other through the darkest hours. One evening, as the crisis was finally ending, Jean-Baptiste formally called on the Rousseau family. He wore his best clothes and brought a small gift, a carved wooden box he had traded for with a native craftsman. Michel and Marguerite received him warmly, and after the usual pleasantries, Jean-Baptiste cleared his throat nervously. "Monsieur Rousseau, Madame, I would like to ask your permission to court your daughter." Michel and Marguerite exchanged glances, and Jean-Baptiste saw the smile that passed between them. "We would be honored," Michel said. "Geneviève has made her feelings quite clear, and we trust her judgment." Geneviève, who had been sitting demurely with her hands folded, looked up with a radiant smile that made Jean-Baptiste's heart skip. "Thank you," he said, feeling suddenly light-headed with relief and joy. They spent the evening together, talking and laughing. the shadow of the epidemic finally lifting. When Jean-Baptiste left, Geneviève walked him to the door. In the privacy of the doorway, he took her hand and raised it to his lips. "I will make you happy," he promised. "You already do," she replied, and kissed him a longer, deeper kiss than the first one they had shared, full of promise and passion. Chapter 6. The Confrontation. With the epidemic over, Jean-Baptiste returned his attention to the trap they had set for Claude Vachon. The false shipment had been staged during the height of the sickness, when everyone was too distracted to pay much attention. Now they waited to see if Vachon would take the bait. They did not have to wait long. 3 nights after Jean-Baptiste's formal courtship of Geneviève began, the watchers hidden near the warehouse saw movement. Vachon and his 2 accomplices approached the building where the false supplies were stored. They moved quietly, clearly believing themselves unobserved. Jean-Baptiste, watching from concealment with Captain Dumont and 6 soldiers, felt his pulse quicken. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for. Vachon picked the lock on the warehouse door with practiced ease. The 3 men slipped inside and began loading supplies into sacks. They worked quickly and efficiently, clearly experienced at this task. "Now," Captain Dumont whispered. "Wait," Jean-Baptiste replied. "Let them commit themselves fully." They watched as the thieves made multiple trips, carrying the stolen goods to a pirogue hidden in the marsh. When the boat was nearly full, Jean-Baptiste gave the signal. The soldiers moved in swiftly, surrounding the thieves before they could react. Torches flared to life, illuminating the scene. "Claude Vachon," Captain Dumont announced formally, "you are under arrest for theft from the colonial stores." Vachon's face went through a series of expressions: shock, fear, calculation. Then he drew a pistol from his belt. "Stay back," he shouted. "I'll shoot." "There are 7 of us and 3 of you," Jean-Baptiste said calmly. "And you have 1 shot. Be reasonable, Vachon." "Reasonable?" Vachon's laugh was bitter. "You want me to be reasonable? I have spent 3 years in this hellhole, watching incompetent fools waste resources while I did all the real work. I deserve compensation for my efforts." "You deserve a noose," Captain Dumont said coldly. Vachon swung his pistol toward the captain, and Jean-Baptiste moved without thinking. He lunged forward, knocking the weapon aside just as it discharged. The ball went wild, and then the soldiers were on the thieves, wrestling them to the ground. In the struggle, Vachon managed to break free. He ran toward the marsh, but Jean-Baptiste was faster. He tackled the supply master, and they went down together in the mud. Vachon was heavier, but Jean-Baptiste had been trained in combat. Within moments, he had Vachon pinned. The man's arm twisted behind his back. "It's over," Jean-Baptiste said, breathing hard. Vachon sagged in defeat. "Damn you, Mercier!" They hauled the 3 men back to the settlement and locked them in the small jail, really just a reinforced storage room. By morning, the entire settlement knew what had happened. People gathered in the square, angry and demanding justice. Governor Bienville called a formal hearing for that afternoon. The entire settlement attended, crowding into and around the governor's residence. Jean-Baptiste presented the evidence, the discrepancies in the supply records, his observation of the hidden cash, and the attempted theft of the false shipment. Vachon tried to defend himself, claiming he had been framed, that Jean-Baptiste had fabricated the evidence out of personal animosity. But his 2 accomplices, faced with the certainty of hanging, turned on him, describing in detail how Vachon had recruited them and organized the theft operation. The evidence was overwhelming. The council deliberated for less than an hour before returning with their verdict: guilty on all counts. "Claude Vachon," Governor Bienville pronounced, "you have betrayed the trust of this settlement and endangered the lives of every person here. The penalty for theft of colonial supplies is death by hanging. The sentence will be carried out tomorrow at dawn." A murmur ran through the crowd, satisfaction mixed with grim necessity. This was frontier justice, harsh but essential for maintaining order in a precarious settlement. Vachon's accomplices, who had cooperated with the investigation, were sentenced to hard labor and banishment from the colony. They would be sent to Mobile, and forbidden to return to Isle Dauphine. That evening, Jean-Baptiste walked along the beach with Geneviève. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors, but he felt no joy in the beauty. Tomorrow, a man would die. And though that man was guilty and deserved his fate, Jean-Baptiste took no pleasure in it. "You did what was necessary," Geneviève said, as if reading his thoughts. "I know, but it still feels heavy." She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "That is because you are a good man, a man who takes no pleasure in death, even when it is just." They walked in silence for a while, the waves lapping at their feet. "What happens now?" Geneviève asked. "After tomorrow, we recover the stolen supplies. We strengthen our security. We try to rebuild trust." He stopped and turned to face her. "And I would like to marry you, if you will have me." Her eyes widened. "Jean-Baptiste, I know I should wait, should court you properly for months. But life here is uncertain. The epidemic taught me that. We could have died, any of us, at any time. I do not want to waste the time we have." "Neither do I," she said softly. She reached up and pulled him down for a kiss. This one fierce and passionate, full of all the emotion they had been holding back. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of lavender and herbs and Geneviève. "I will make you happy," he promised again. "I know you will." They stood there on the beach as the sun set, holding each other, two people who had found love in the midst of hardship and uncertainty. Chapter 7. Justice and New Beginnings. The hanging took place at dawn, as was customary. The entire settlement gathered to witness it not out of bloodlust, but because justice in the colony was a communal affair. Everyone needed to see that the law was upheld, that theft and betrayal would not be tolerated. Jean-Baptiste stood with the other officers, his face impassive. Vachon was led to the gallows, his hands bound, his face pale but defiant. Father Raphael offered him the chance to confess and receive absolution. Vachon refused. "I regret nothing," he said loudly, addressing the crowd. "You are all fools, wasting your lives in this miserable place for a king who does not care if you live or die. I only regret that I did not steal more." Governor Bienville gave the signal. The trap dropped, and Claude Vachon died quickly, his neck breaking with an audible snap. The crowd was silent, the only sound the cry of seabirds and the whisper of the wind. It was done. The body was cut down and buried in unconsecrated ground, as was the fate of criminals. The settlement dispersed, returning to their daily tasks. Life went on. In the days that followed, Jean-Baptiste and Captain Dumont led an expedition to recover the stolen supplies. They found Vachon's hidden cache and several other locations where goods had been stashed. Much of it was still usable, and its recovery significantly improved the settlement's supply situation. The investigation also revealed that Vachon had been selling the stolen goods to unscrupulous traders in Mobile, who resold them at inflated prices. Governor Bienville sent a strongly worded letter to the authorities in Mobile, and several arrests were made there as well. With the crisis resolved, the settlement began to look toward the future with renewed hope. The summer sickness had passed, the thief had been caught, and a supply ship was expected within the month. Jean-Baptiste and Geneviève were married in late July, in a ceremony conducted by Father Raphael in the small chapel. The entire settlement attended, grateful for a reason to celebrate after so much hardship. Geneviève wore a cream-colored silk gown that her mother had brought from France and saved for this occasion. Her dark hair was dressed with flowers, and she wore a simple gold cross that had belonged to her grandmother. She was so beautiful that Jean-Baptiste felt his throat tighten with emotion when he saw her walking toward him on her father's arm. The ceremony was simple but moving. They exchanged vows in French, promising to love and honor each other for as long as they both should live. When Father Raphael pronounced them man and wife, Jean-Baptiste kissed his bride to the cheers and applause of the settlement. The celebration that followed was the most joyous the settlement had seen in months. tables were laden with food, fish, and oysters from the Gulf, vegetables from the gardens, and even some precious wine that Michel had been saving. The fiddler played, and people danced until late into the night. Jean-Baptiste and Geneviève danced together, lost in each other's eyes, oblivious to the crowd around them. When they finally slipped away to the small house that Jean-Baptiste had prepared for them, a modest dwelling, but clean and well built, they were both giddy with happiness and anticipation. Inside, Jean-Baptiste lit candles, while Geneviève stood by the window, looking out at the moonlit water. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "Are you happy?" he murmured into her hair. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied, turning in his arms to face him. He kissed her then, slowly and deeply, his hands moving to the laces of her gown. She helped him, her fingers trembling slightly with nervousness and excitement. The gown fell away, followed by her stays and petticoats, until she stood before him in only her shift, the thin linen revealing the curves of her body in the candlelight. "You are so beautiful," he whispered, his voice rough with desire. She reached up and began to unbutton his waistcoat, her eyes never leaving his. "And you are mine," she said. "Finally mine." They came together with passion and tenderness, discovering each other in the flickering candlelight. Jean-Baptiste was gentle, mindful of her innocence, but Geneviève met him with a passion that matched his own. They made love slowly, savoring every touch, every kiss, every whispered word of love. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, her head on his chest, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "I love you," he said. "I will love you until the day I die." "And I love you," she replied. "Whatever comes, we will face it together." Chapter 8. The Birth of Hope. Spring came to Isle Dauphine in 1716, with an explosion of wildflowers and the return of countless birds migrating north from the tropics. The island seemed to pulse with new life, and nowhere was this more evident than in the small house Jean-Baptiste had built for his growing family. Geneviève's labor began on a warm April morning, just as the sun broke over the Gulf. Her mother, Marguerite, and two other women from the settlement, Madame Dubois and the Choctaw woman they called Marie, attended her. At the same time, Jean-Baptiste paced outside, his hands clenched and unclenched with nervous energy. "Your first child is always the hardest weight," Michel Rousseau said, placing a hand on his son-in-law's shoulder. "But Geneviève is strong. She will be fine." The hours stretched on. Jean-Baptiste could hear Geneviève's cries through the palmetto-thatched walls, each one making him wince. He had faced pirates, thieves, and hurricanes, but nothing had prepared him for this helpless waiting. Finally, as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon, a new sound joined the chorus, the thin, indignant wail of a newborn. Marguerite appeared at the door, her face flushed but smiling. "You have a son, Jean-Baptiste, a healthy, strong son, and Geneviève is well." He rushed inside to find his wife, propped against pillows, her hair damp with sweat, her face exhausted but radiant. In her arms, wrapped in soft linen, was a tiny red-faced creature with a shock of dark hair. "Jean-Baptiste," Geneviève whispered, her voice hoarse, "meet your son." He knelt beside the bed, his hands trembling as he touched the baby's impossibly small fingers. The infant grasped his thumb with surprising strength, and Jean-Baptiste felt something shift in his chest, a fierce, overwhelming love, unlike anything he had ever known. "What shall we name him?" Geneviève asked. Jean-Baptiste thought of his own father, dead these 10 years, and of the new world they were building on this island. "Alexandra," he said. "Alexandra Michel Mercier, for new beginnings, and for your father." "Alexandre," Geneviève repeated, testing the name. "Yes, it suits him." That evening, as the settlement celebrated the birth with wine and song, Jean-Baptiste held his son and looked out at the Gulf. The water was calm, reflecting the stars like scattered diamonds. He thought of all the challenges they had faced, all the hardships yet to come. But with Geneviève beside him and Alexandra in his arms, he felt ready for anything. He had no way of knowing that within a year, everything would change. Chapter 9. The Great Storm. The summer of 1717 began with an oppressive heat that seemed to press down on the island like a physical weight. The air was thick and still, and even the birds seemed subdued. The Choctaw who came to trade spoke in worried tones about the signs, the strange color of the sunset, the behavior of the animals, the feel of the wind. Big storm coming, old Chief Red Shoes told Governor Bienville through his interpreter. Bigger than before. The spirits are angry. Bienville, ever practical, ordered preparations. But even he could not have anticipated what was coming. The hurricane struck on September 15th with a fury that made the previous year's storm seem like a gentle breeze. The wind howled like 1,000 demons, and the storm surge rose higher than anyone had thought possible. 15 feet, then 20, then more. Jean-Baptiste, Geneviève, and baby Alexandra huddled in the strongest building on the island, the stone warehouse that had been built to withstand anything. Around them were dozens of other families, pressed together in the darkness, praying and weeping as the world outside tore itself apart. The storm lasted for 2 days. When it finally passed, and they emerged into the devastated landscape, what they saw broke their hearts. The settlement was gone. Not damaged, gone. Every wooden structure had been swept away. The chapel, the governor's residence, the homes they had built with such care, all reduced to scattered timbers and debris. Bodies floated in the floodwaters. The harbor was choked with wreckage. Of the 300 souls who had called Isle Dauphine home, fewer than 200 had survived. Governor Bienville stood amid the ruins, his face gray with shock and grief. "We cannot stay," he said quietly. "The island is too vulnerable. We must move the capital to the mainland." Over the following weeks, as survivors salvaged what they could and buried their dead, plans were made to relocate to Mobile. Some families would go to Biloxi. Eventually, Bienville knew the capital would need to move to the new settlement being built upriver New Orleans. "We should go with them," Michel Rousseau urged his daughter and son-in-law. "There is nothing left here. Mobile will offer better opportunities, better protection." But Jean-Baptiste and Geneviève stood on the beach, looking out at the gulf that had nearly killed them, and felt something stubborn take root in their hearts. "No," Geneviève said. "This is our home. Alexandra was born here. We will rebuild." "The island will never be the capital again," Michel protested. "It will be forgotten, a backwater." "Perhaps," Jean-Baptiste agreed, "but it will be our backwater, and we are not the only ones who feel this way." He was right. A handful of families, perhaps 30 people in all, chose to remain. They were the stubborn ones, the ones who had fallen in love with the island despite its dangers. They rebuilt their homes, this time with stone foundations and stronger walls. They replanted their gardens. They fished the rich waters and traded with the Choctaw and the settlements on the mainland. Life went on, quieter now, but no less meaningful. Chapter 10. Growing up on the island. Alexandre Mercier grew up with sand between his toes and salt in his hair. By the time he was 5, he could swim like a fish and identify every bird that visited the island. By 10, he could handle a pirogue, the flat-bottomed boats they used to travel to Mobile, with the skill of a man twice his age. He was a beautiful child, with his mother's green eyes and his father's strong features. But more than that, he had inherited their courage and their stubborn determination. The island settlement remained small through the 1,722 and 1,730. New families occasionally arrived, usually those fleeing debts or troubles on the mainland, seeking a fresh start. The Merciers' home became a center of the community, with Geneviève serving as midwife and healer, and Jean-Baptiste as the unofficial magistrate when disputes arose. They had 2 more children, a daughter, Marie-Claire, born in 1719, and another son, Louis, born in 1722. The house rang with laughter and arguments. with the sounds of children playing and learning. Jean-Baptiste taught Alexandra everything he knew about navigation, about reading the weather, about dealing fairly with both the French authorities in Mobile and the native peoples who were their neighbors. Geneviève taught all three children to read and write, using the few precious books they owned and whatever paper they could obtain from the mainland. Education is the only inheritance that cannot be stolen or destroyed, she told them. Remember that. By 1740, Alexandre was 24 years old, tall and strong, with his father's sense of justice and his mother's compassionate heart. He had made the journey to Mobile countless times, trading fish and oysters for supplies the island could not produce. He had learned to speak passable Choctaw and even some English from the British traders who occasionally ventured into French territory. He had also, much to his parents' amusement and concern, developed a reputation as something of a heartbreaker among the young women of both the island and Mobile. "You need to settle down," Geneviève told him one evening as they sat on the porch of the family home, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. "You are not getting any younger." "I am only 24, Maman," Alexandre protested, grinning. "Surely I have time. Your father and I were married when I was 19, and he was 26, she reminded him. "And look how well that turned out." Jean-Baptiste, now in his 50s but still vigorous, laughed. "Do not pressure the boy, mon coeur. He will know when he meets the right woman. It will hit him like a hurricane." Alexandre rolled his eyes at his parents' romantic notions. He enjoyed the company of women, certainly enjoyed it very much, in fact, but he had never felt that overwhelming connection his parents described. That was about to change. Chapter 11. The Pirate's Daughter. The ship appeared on the horizon on a hot July morning in 1741, its sails tattered and its hull riding low in the water. Alexandre was fishing from his pirogue when he spotted it, and something about the vessel's desperate approach made him paddle quickly back to shore. "Papa," he called, running toward the house. A ship in distress. By the time the vessel limped into the shallow harbor, half the settlement had gathered on the beach. The ship was a small merchant sloop, and it had clearly been through hell. Bullet holes pocked the hull, and dark stains on the deck suggested blood had been spilled. The captain, a grizzled man named Etienne Beaumont, told a harrowing tale. They had been attacked by pirates 3 days earlier, the notorious crew of Captain Marcus Teach, who claimed to be a distant relation of the infamous Blackbeard. The pirates had killed several crew members and stolen most of their cargo before a sudden squall allowed them to escape. "We need repairs before we can make it to Mobile," Beaumont said, "and we have wounded men who need care." "Bring them ashore," Jean-Baptiste said immediately. "We will do what we can." As the crew began to disembark, Alexandre noticed a figure standing at the rail, a young woman in men's clothing, her dark hair bound back in a queue, a cutlass at her hip. She moved with a predatory grace as she descended to the beach, her eyes scanning the settlement with an intensity that made Alexandre's breath catch. "Who is that?" he asked Captain Beaumont. The captain's expression grew complicated. "That is Isabelle, my ward, I suppose you could say. Her father was Jean-Marc Delacroix." Alexandre knew that name. Every sailor in the Gulf knew it. Jean-Marc Delacroix had been one of the most feared pirates in these waters before he was killed in a battle with a Spanish warship 5 years earlier. "She is a pirate's daughter?" Alexandre said, unable to keep the fascination from his voice. "Was," Beaumont corrected. "Her father left her in my care before he died, made me promise to keep her safe and teach her an honest trade. She has been sailing with me for 3 years now. She is the best navigator I have ever seen, and she can fight like a demon when she needs to, but she is trying to leave that life behind." Alexandre could not take his eyes off her. She was perhaps 20 years old, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of dark honey. There was something wild about her, something untamed, and he felt drawn to her like iron to a lodestone. She caught him staring and raised an eyebrow, a slight smirk playing at her lips. Then she turned away, dismissing him, and Alexandre felt the sting of that dismissal like a slap. Over the next several days, As Captain Beaumont's crew made repairs to their ship, Alexandra found himself constantly aware of Isabel's presence. She helped with the repairs, climbing the rigging with fearless ease, her muscles flexing beneath her loose linen shirt. She swam in the Gulf each morning, her strokes strong and sure. She practiced with her cutlass in the evenings, the blade flashing in the fading light. And she completely ignored Alexandra's attempts to speak with her. "You are wasting your time," his sister Marie-Claire teased. "She is clearly not interested. She has not given me a chance to show her what she is missing," Alexandra replied, with more confidence than he felt. Finally, on the fourth evening, he found Isabel sitting alone on the beach, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. He approached cautiously, as one might approach a wild animal. "May I sit?" he asked. She shrugged, which he took as permission. They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Isabel spoke, her voice low and slightly rough, as if she was not accustomed to using it for casual conversation. "You have been following me around like a lost puppy for days. What do you want?" Alexandra felt his face heat. "I want to know you, to talk with you." "Why?" "Because you are the most interesting person I have ever met." She laughed, a short, sharp sound. "You do not know anything about me. Then tell me. Tell me about your life, about where you have been, what you have seen." Isabel turned to look at him thoroughly for the first time, her honey-colored eyes searching his face. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she began to talk. She told him about growing up on her father's ship, about learning to navigate by the stars before she could read. She told him about the violence and the freedom of pirate life, about the terrible things she had seen and the terrible things she had done. She told him about her father's death, about Captain Beaumont's promise, about her struggle to become someone different from what she had been raised to be. "I am trying to be good," she said quietly, "but sometimes I do not know if it is possible. The sea is in my blood, and so is violence. I am not like the gentle women of your settlement." "Thank God for that," Alexandra said fervently. "I have no interest in gentle women. I want someone alive, who is real, who has seen the world and survived it." She studied him for a long moment, then smiled, a genuine smile this time, not the mocking smirk she had shown before. "You are either very brave or very foolish, Alexandra Mercier." "Perhaps both," he admitted. She leaned closer, and he could smell the salt on her skin, the faint scent of the soap she used. "I am not an easy woman to love. I have a temper. I do not like to be told what to do. I will never be content to sit at home and sew." "I would never ask you to be," Alexandra said, his heart pounding. "I would only ask you to be yourself." "Then kiss me," she said, "and we will see if you can handle what you are asking for." He kissed her, and it was nothing like the sweet, tentative kisses he had shared with other girls. Isabel kissed, like she did everything else, with fierce intensity and no hesitation. Her hands tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, and he felt desire surge through him like a wave. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Isabel laughed. "Well, perhaps you are not as soft as you look." "I am full of surprises," Alexandra managed to say. "Good," she said. "I hate to be bored." Chapter 12. The Smuggler's Scheme. Captain Beaumont's ship departed a week later, but Isabel remained behind. She had made her decision, though she claimed it was only temporary. "I will stay for a few months," she told Alexandre, "to see if I can bear this quiet life. But I make no promises." Those months turned into a year, and then two. Isabel proved to be as capable on land as she was at sea. She helped with the fishing, taught the settlement's children to swim, and occasionally traveled with Alexandre to Mobile to trade. Her reputation as Jean-Marc Delacroix's daughter preceded her, and more than one merchant tried to cheat them until Isabel drew her cutlass and reminded them that she had not forgotten all her father's lessons. Jean-Baptiste and Geneviève were initially uncertain about their son's choice, but Isabel won them over with her honesty and her fierce loyalty to Alexandre. By 1744, when Alexandra asked her to marry him, they gladly gave their blessing. The wedding was a wild affair, with Captain Beaumont sailing in with a hold full of rum and half the settlement drunk by sunset. Isabel wore a dress for the first time in years, a simple gown of blue linen that Genevieve had made, but she kept her cutlass strapped to her thigh beneath the skirts, which made Alexandre laugh until he cried. Their wedding night was passionate and uninhibited, with Isabel taking the lead as often as Alexandra. She was not shy about her desires, and she taught him pleasures he had never imagined. They made love with the windows open, the Gulf breeze cooling their heated skin, and afterward lay tangled together, talking and laughing until dawn. "I never thought I could be happy like this," Isabel confessed, her head on his chest. "I thought I was too damaged, too wild." "You are wild," Alexandra agreed, running his fingers through her hair. "But that is what I love about you. You are like the sea itself, beautiful and dangerous and free." "Not so free anymore," she said, but she was smiling. "I am bound to you now, Alexandre Mercier, for better or worse." "For better," he promised. "Always for better." But trouble was brewing, as it always seemed to, on Isle Dauphine. A man named Christophe Arnaud had arrived on the island 6 months earlier, claiming to be a merchant seeking a quiet place to establish a trading post. He was smooth-tongued and charming, with money to spend and gifts for the children. He built a large house on the eastern end of the island and began making regular trips to Mobile and New Orleans. Jean-Baptiste, now in his 60s but still sharp, did not trust him. "There is something wrong about that man," he told Alexandra one evening. "He claims to be a merchant, but I have never seen him sell anything, only buy, and always with gold coin, never with credit or trade goods." "Perhaps he is simply wealthy," Alexandra suggested. "Perhaps," Jean-Baptiste said. "Or perhaps he is a smuggler, using our island as a base for illegal trade." Isabel, who had been listening, spoke up. "I know smugglers. I grew up around them. And you are right. Arnaud has that look about him. The question is, what is he smuggling?" They soon found out. One night in late summer, Alexandra and Isabel were walking on the beach when they saw lights out on the water, a ship anchored just offshore with small boats rowing back and forth between the vessel and Arnaud's property. "Stay here," Alexandra told Isabel. "Like hell," she replied, and before he could stop her, she was moving silently through the darkness toward Arnaud's house. Alexandre followed, his heart in his throat. They crept close enough to see men unloading crates from the boats and carrying them into Arnaud's warehouse. The crates were marked with Spanish seals. "Stolen goods," Isabel whispered, "probably taken from Spanish ships. Arnaud is fencing them through Mobile and New Orleans." "We need to tell my father," Alexandra said. But before they could retreat, a hand clamped down on Alexandra's shoulder. He spun to find Arnaud himself, a pistol in his hand, and murder in his eyes. "Well, well," Arnaud said softly, "the curious young couple. I had hoped you would mind your own business, but I suppose that was too much to ask." "Let us go," Alexandra said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We have seen nothing." "You have seen everything," Arnaud replied, "which means you are now a problem that needs to be solved." He gestured with the pistol, and 2 of his men emerged from the shadows. "Take them to the warehouse. We will deal with them after the cargo is secured." They were dragged into the warehouse and bound with rough rope. Arnaud's men were efficient and brutal, and Alexandre felt blood trickling from his split lip. Beside him, Isabel was silent, but he could feel the tension in her body, like a coiled spring waiting to release. "What will you do with us?" Alexandra asked. Arnaud smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "You will have an unfortunate accident. A drowning, perhaps. The Gulf is so dangerous, after all. Your bodies will wash up in a few days, and everyone will mourn the tragic loss." He left them there, guarded by 1 man, while the rest continued unloading the ship. "Can you reach your knife?" Isabel whispered. "What knife?" "The one you always keep in your boot. I have seen it." Alexandre had forgotten about the small blade he carried. Slowly, painfully, he worked his bound hands down toward his boot. The guard was watching the door, bored and inattentive. Alexandre's fingers closed around the knife handle, It took 10 agonizing minutes to cut through the ropes binding his wrists. As soon as he was free, he cut Isabel's bonds, then handed her the knife. "Now what?" he whispered. Isabel's smile was feral. "Now we fight." She moved like lightning, crossing the warehouse in 3 silent strides and driving the knife into the guard's kidney before he could cry out. The man collapsed, and Isabel caught him, lowering him silently to the floor. "Jesus," Alexandra breathed. "I told you I was not gentle," Isabel said, wiping the blade on the dead man's shirt. "Now let us go get help before they realize we are gone." They slipped out of the warehouse and ran through the darkness toward the settlement. Jean-Baptiste was still awake, sitting on his porch with a pipe, and he leaped to his feet when he saw them. "What happened?" Alexandra quickly explained. Jean-Baptiste's face grew hard. "Gather the men," he said. "All of them. We end this tonight." Chapter 13. Justice on the Beach. 20 men from the settlement, armed with muskets, pistols, and whatever weapons they could find, surrounded Arnaud's warehouse, just as the smugglers were finishing their work. Jean-Baptiste, despite his age, led them, with Alexandra and Isabel at his side. "Christophe Arnaud," Jean-Baptiste called out, "you are under arrest for smuggling, for assault, and for attempted murder. Surrender now, and you will be given a fair trial in Mobile." Arnaud emerged from the warehouse, his face twisted with rage. "You have no authority here, old man. This island is no longer even part of the official territory. You are nothing but squatters." "We are French citizens," Jean-Baptiste replied, "and we have every right to defend ourselves and our home. Now surrender, or we will take you by force." Arnaud's hand moved toward his pistol, and everything happened at once. Isabel, faster than anyone, drew her cutlass and threw it like a spear. The blade caught Arnaud in the shoulder, spinning him around. His pistol discharged harmlessly into the air. His men, seeing their leader wounded and outnumbered, threw down their weapons. The smugglers were bound and held in the settlement's small jail, really just a reinforced shed, until a boat could be sent to Mobile to fetch the authorities. Arnaud, his shoulder bandaged but his spirit broken, confessed everything. He had been stealing from Spanish ships for years, using Isle Dauphine as a base because he thought the small settlement would be easy to intimidate. He had not counted on the Mercier family. The French authorities from Mobile arrived a week later and took Arnaud and his men away. There was talk of a trial, but Arnaud died of fever before it could take place. Some said it was divine justice. Others said it was poison administered by one of his own men, seeking to avoid being implicated. Either way, the threat was ended. The settlement celebrated with a feast, and Jean-Baptiste stood before the gathered families, his arm around Geneviève, and spoke. "We have been through much together," he said. "Hurricanes, disease, thieves, and now smugglers. But we have survived because we stand together. Because we are a family, all of us. This island may no longer be the capital or important to the authorities in New Orleans, but it is important to us. It is our home, and we will defend it, always." The crowd cheered, and Alexandra felt a surge of pride. His father was old now, his hair white, and his movement slower, but his spirit was undiminished. That night, as Alexandre and Isabel lay in their bed, she placed his hand on her belly. "I am with child," she said quietly. "I have known for a few weeks, but with everything happening, I did not want to distract you." Alexandra felt tears spring to his eyes. "A child. Our child. Are you happy?" she asked, and he heard uncertainty in her voice, a rare thing for Isabel. "I am more than happy," he said, pulling her close. "I am blessed beyond measure." Their daughter, Céleste, was born in the spring of 1746. With Geneviève attending the birth and Jean-Baptiste pacing outside, just as he had done 30 years earlier. Céleste had her mother's dark hair and her father's green eyes, and from the moment she drew her first breath, she had both of them wrapped around her tiny finger. Chapter 14. The Changing World. The years passed, and the world around Isle Dauphine continued to change. In Europe, France and Britain fought their endless wars, and those conflicts rippled across the ocean to the colonies. The French and Indian War, what the Europeans called the 7 Years' War, began in 1754, and suddenly, the Gulf Coast was no longer a backwater, but a strategic prize. Jean-Baptiste died in 1755, at the age of 71, with Geneviève holding his hand, and his children and grandchildren gathered around him. His last words were, "Take care of the island. Take care of each other." They buried him on a hill overlooking the Gulf, and Geneviève visited his grave every day until her own death 3 years later. She was 72, and she died peacefully in her sleep, a smile on her face. Alexandre liked to think she had gone to join his father wherever he was. By 1763, when the Treaty of Paris ended the war, Alexandre was 47 years old, with silver threading through his dark hair. Isabelle was 42, still strong and vital, though she had finally given up wearing men's clothing in favor of practical skirts and blouses. Céleste was 17, beautiful and headstrong, with her mother's wild spirit and her father's sense of justice. And the island was no longer French. The news came in the fall. France had ceded all its territory east of the Mississippi to Britain. Isle Dauphine, Mobile, Pensacola, all of it now belonged to the British Crown. "What does this mean for us?" Céleste asked, her young face troubled. Alexandre looked at Isabelle, then at his daughter. "It means we adapt," he said, "as we always have. We are still the same people, still the same families. The flag may change, but we remain." "Your grandfather would say the same thing," Isabelle added. "He survived French rule, Spanish threats, pirates, and hurricanes. We will survive the British, too." But as the first British ships appeared on the horizon, flying the Union Jack, Alexandre could not help but feel that an era had ended. The French Louisiana that his parents had helped build was gone, swept away by the tides of history as surely as the hurricane of 1717 had swept away the original settlement. Yet the island remained, and so did they. The story of the Mercier family was far from over. Chapter 15. The Redcoats arrive. 1764 to 1780. The British arrived on Isle Dauphine in the spring of 1764 with a purpose. A small garrison of soldiers, led by a young captain named William Ashford, established a post on the eastern end of the island to monitor traffic in and out of Mobile Bay. Captain Ashford was 28 years old, the third son of a minor nobleman, sent to the colonies to make his fortune because there was no inheritance awaiting him at home. He was tall and fair-haired, with blue eyes that seemed to take in everything, and a manner that was both courteous and commanding. He was also, much to Céleste Mercier's annoyance, infuriatingly attractive. "I do not like him," she announced at dinner one evening, her dark eyes flashing. "He is too British." Her father laughed. "What does that mean, exactly? He is so proper, so formal. He acts as if he owns the island." "In a sense, he does," Isabelle pointed out. "Or rather, his king does. We are British subjects now, whether we like it or not." Céleste scowled. She had grown up hearing stories of her French heritage, of her grandparents' courage in building a life on this island. The idea of bowing to British authority rankled. "We should resist," she said. "We should refuse to cooperate with them." "And accomplish what?" Alexandre asked gently. "Céleste, I understand your feelings, but we are 30 families on a small island. The British Empire spans the globe. We must be practical." "Practical," Céleste muttered. Grandfather Jean-Baptiste was not practical. He was brave. "He was both," Isabelle corrected. "And that is why he survived. Bravery without wisdom is just foolishness." But Céleste was 17 and full of righteous anger, and she was not ready to be wise. She made a point of avoiding the British soldiers, of speaking only French, even when addressed in English, of making her disdain clear. The other young people of the settlement followed her lead, creating a cold divide between the French families and the British garrison. Captain Ashford, for his part, seemed more amused than offended by Celeste's hostility. He made a point of greeting her politely whenever their paths crossed, of asking after her family's health, of complimenting her in his careful, formal way. It drove her mad. "Why does he not just leave me alone?" she complained to her mother. Isabel smiled knowingly. "Because he is interested in you, obviously." "Well, I am not interested in him." "Are you certain about that?" Celeste opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again. The truth was, she thought about Captain Ashford more than she wanted to admit. She noticed the way his uniform fit his broad shoulders, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the way he treated his men with respect rather than cruelty. But he was British, and she was French, and that was that. Or so she told herself. Chapter 16. The Fever Season. The summer of 1765 brought another outbreak of yellow fever, though not as severe as the one that had struck in 1715. Still, people died, including 2 of Captain Ashford's soldiers. Celeste, who had learned healing from her grandmother Geneviève, found herself torn between her principles and her compassion. When a 3rd British soldier fell ill, burning with fever and delirious, she made her decision. She appeared at the British garrison with her basket of herbs and remedies. Captain Ashford met her at the door, his face haggard with worry and lack of sleep. "Mademoiselle Mercier, I did not expect to see you here." "I am a healer," she said stiffly. "It is my duty to help the sick, regardless of other considerations." Something softened in his expression. "Thank you. Truly, we have lost 2 men already, and Private Morrison is in a bad way." She pushed past him into the building they were using as an infirmary. Private Morrison was indeed in a bad way, his skin yellow-tinged, his breathing shallow, his body racked with chills despite the summer heat. Celeste set to work, brewing her grandmother's fever tea, applying cool compresses, forcing small sips of water between the young man's cracked lips. Captain Ashford watched her work, and gradually he began to help, following her instructions without question. They worked through the night. Sometime around dawn, Private Morrison's fever broke, and he fell into a natural sleep. "You saved his life," Captain Ashford said quietly. Celeste was exhausted, her dress stained with sweat and medicine, her hair falling loose from its pins. Perhaps he would have recovered anyway. Yellow fever is unpredictable. "Nevertheless, I am grateful." He paused, then added, "You are not what I expected, Mademoiselle Mercier." "What did you expect?" "I am not sure, but not this. Not someone so skilled, so compassionate, so—" He trailed off, seeming to realize he was saying too much. "So French?" she supplied, a hint of her old hostility returning. "So remarkable," he finished. They looked at each other in the growing light, and Celeste felt something shift between them. She saw him not as a British officer, not as a representative of the power that had taken her homeland, but as a man, a good man, trying to do his duty in a difficult situation. "I should go," she said, suddenly flustered. "My parents will worry." "Of course. But please, if you would be willing to return, to check on Morrison and teach me more of your healing methods, I would be grateful." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and fled. Over the following weeks, she returned to the garrison regularly, ostensibly to check on Private Morrison's recovery, but she and Captain Ashford both knew the real reason. They talked as she worked, sharing stories of their lives, their families, their dreams. She learned that William Ashford had not wanted to be a soldier, that he had dreamed of being a scholar, studying history and languages, but duty to his family had required him to take a commission. He learned that Celeste had grown up on stories of adventure, that she could navigate by the stars and handle a boat as well as any man, that she dreamed of seeing the world beyond the island. "Perhaps you will," he said one evening as they sat on the garrison's porch, watching the sun set over the Gulf. "The world is larger than you imagine, and full of wonders. Have you seen much of it?" "Some. I have been to London, to Boston, to Charlestown. Each place is different, with its own character, its own beauty. "Tell me about London," she said. And he did, painting pictures with his words of a city vast and teeming, of theaters and coffee houses, of the Thames and the Tower. She listened, enchanted, and when he reached out to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, she did not pull away. "Céleste," he said softly, "I know this is complicated. I know there are 100 reasons why we should not, why this cannot." "Then do not say anything," she whispered. "Just kiss me." He did, and it was nothing as she had imagined. It was gentle and sweet, tentative and questioning, and it made her heart race in a way that terrified and thrilled her. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I am falling in love with you," he said. "I know I should not. I know it is impossible, but I cannot help it." "It is not impossible," she said, surprising herself. "Difficult? Yes. Complicated? Certainly. But not impossible." Chapter 17. Divided Loyalties. Their courtship was conducted in secret at first. Stolen moments when no one was watching, whispered conversations in the twilight. But secrets are hard to keep in a small settlement, and soon everyone knew. The reaction was mixed. Some of the French families were scandalized. How could Céleste, the granddaughter of the legendary Jean-Baptiste and Geneviève, consort with a British officer? Others were more pragmatic, seeing the potential advantages of an alliance with the garrison commander. Alexandra and Isabelle were cautious, but not opposed. "Do you love him?" Isabelle asked her daughter bluntly. Céleste hesitated, then nodded. "I do. I know I should not, but I do." "Then that is what matters," Isabelle said. "Your grandfather married a merchant's daughter when he was a soldier with no prospects. I was a pirate's daughter when your father married me. Love does not care about politics or propriety." "But what about our heritage, our French blood?" Alexandro spoke up. "You are French, yes, but you are also yourself, Céleste Mercier. Unique and irreplaceable. You do not betray your heritage by loving someone from a different background. You honor it by being true to your heart." But not everyone felt that way. A man named François Dubois, whose father had been one of the original settlers, began speaking out against Céleste's relationship with Captain Ashford. He was in his 40s, bitter and angry, convinced that the British were destroying the French way of life. "She is a traitor," he declared at a community gathering. "She spreads her legs for the enemy, while our culture dies." Alexandra was on his feet in an instant, his face dark with rage. "You will apologize for that, Dubois, or I will make you apologize. I speak only the truth." "You speak filth and lies." Alexandra's hand moved to his knife. "My daughter is a healer, a good woman, and she has done nothing to be ashamed of. Now apologize, or face me." Dubois, seeing the fury in Alexandra's eyes, and remembering that this was Isabelle's husband, Isabelle, who had killed men with her bare hands, backed down. "I apologize," he muttered. "I spoke in anger." But the damage was done. The settlement was divided, with some supporting Céleste and others viewing her as a collaborator. Captain Ashford, hearing of the incident, came to the Mercier home to speak with Alexandra. "Sir, I want you to know that my intentions toward your daughter are entirely honorable. I wish to marry her, with your permission." Alexandra studied the young officer. "You understand what you are asking? You will be caught between two worlds, British by birth and duty, but married into a French family. Your superiors may not approve. Your career may suffer. I understand, and I do not care. Céleste is worth any price." Alexandra looked at Isabelle, who nodded slightly. Then he extended his hand. "You have my permission and my blessing. But know this, if you ever hurt her, if you ever betray her, you will answer to me and to her mother. And I assure you, her mother is far more dangerous than I am." William smiled. "I believe you, sir, and I swear to you, I will spend my life making her happy." They were married in the fall of 1766, in a ceremony that blended French and English traditions. Father Pierre, who had served the island's Catholic community for 20 years, performed the service in French, while Captain Ashford's second-in-command read passages in English. The settlement turned out in force, and even François Dubois attended, though he stood at the back and left early. Céleste wore a cream-colored silk gown that had belonged to her grandmother, Geneviève, and had been altered to fit her slender frame. William wore his dress uniform, scarlet and gold, and when he saw his bride walking toward him on her father's arm, his eyes filled with tears. "You are so beautiful," he whispered when she reached him. "And you are so British," she teased. But her own eyes were wet. The celebration lasted long into the night, with French wine and British ale flowing freely, along with dancing, singing, and toasts in 2 languages. Alexandre watched his daughter dance with her new husband and felt the weight of years pressing on him. He was 50 years old now, and he could feel his body beginning to fail in small ways, aches that did not fade, a shortness of breath when he climbed hills. But tonight, he was happy. His daughter had found love just as he had, just as his parents had. The Mercier family continued, adapting and surviving as they always had. Isabelle slipped her hand into his. "What are you thinking?" "I am thinking that we have been blessed," he said. "Despite everything, the storms, the struggles, the changes, we have been blessed." "We have," she agreed, "and we will continue to be. Our family is strong, Alexandra, strong enough to weather anything." She was right, of course, but neither of them could have anticipated what was coming. Chapter 18. The Seeds of Revolution. Céleste and William's first years of marriage were happy ones. They lived in a house William built on the edge of the settlement, close enough to the garrison for him to respond quickly if needed, but far enough for privacy. Their first child, a son they named Jean-Baptiste after Céleste's grandfather, was born in 1768. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed in 1770. The children were a bridge between 2 worlds, baptized in the Catholic Church, but raised speaking both French and English, learning the history of both their heritages. But the world around them was growing increasingly turbulent. In the northern colonies, tensions between Britain and the colonists were escalating. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Boston Massacre, each incident drove the wedge deeper. By 1773, when news of the Boston Tea Party reached the Gulf Coast, it was clear that something was building, something that could not be contained. William found himself in an increasingly difficult position. His loyalty to the crown was unquestioned, but he had come to love the people of Isle Dauphine, to see them as his community rather than as subjects to be governed. When orders came from his superiors to increase taxes and tighten control over trade, he implemented them as gently as possible, often turning a blind eye to small acts of smuggling by French families. This did not go unnoticed. A new officer arrived in 1774, Major Edmund Blackwood, sent to restore proper order to the Gulf Coast territories. Blackwood was everything William was not: rigid, cruel, convinced of British superiority, and contemptuous of the French settlers. "You have gone native, Ashford," Blackwood said during his first inspection of the garrison. "You have forgotten that these people are conquered subjects, not your friends." "They are British subjects now," William replied carefully, "and they have been peaceful and cooperative. I see no reason to antagonize them. Peaceful because they are weak, cooperative because they have no choice. But make no mistake, they hate us. They would rebel in an instant if they thought they could succeed." William wanted to argue, but he knew there was some truth in Blackwood's words. François Dubois and his followers had grown bolder, speaking openly of resistance and of joining the American rebels if war came. The situation came to a head in the spring of 1775, just weeks after the battles of Lexington and Concord. Dubois and a group of men attempted to seize the garrison's weapons cache, planning to arm themselves and declare the island independent. The plot was poorly planned and quickly discovered. Major Blackwood wanted to hang Dubois and his co-conspirators immediately. "They are traitors and rebels," Blackwood declared. "They must be made an example of." William argued for mercy. They are misguided, yes, but they have not actually harmed anyone. Imprisonment, perhaps, or exile, but not execution. You are too soft, Ashford. This is why you will never advance beyond captain. The argument was interrupted by Celeste, who burst into the garrison with fire in her eyes. You cannot hang them, she said. Francois Dubois is a fool, but he is our fool. He is part of this community. If you execute him, you will turn the entire settlement against you. The settlement's feelings are irrelevant, Blackwood said coldly. This is a matter of law and order. This is a matter of justice. Celeste shot back. And justice requires mercy as well as punishment. Blackwood's face reddened. Captain Ashford, control your wife, or I will have her removed. William stepped between them. Major, perhaps we could discuss this privately. What happened in that private discussion, William never told Celeste. But the result was a compromise. Dubois and his men would be imprisoned for 6 months, then released on the condition that they swear loyalty to the crown. It was not a perfect solution, but it prevented bloodshed. However, the incident had consequences. Major Blackwood began watching William closely, looking for any sign of disloyalty. And Francois Dubois, rather than being chastened by his imprisonment, emerged more radical than ever. The Americans are right to rebel, he told anyone who would listen. We should join them. We should drive the British into the sea. Alexandra, now 59 and feeling every year of it, tried to counsel moderation. I understand your anger, Francois, but we are not soldiers. We are fishermen and farmers. If we rebel, we will be crushed. Then we die free, rather than live as slaves. We are not slaves, Alexandra said wearily. We are subjects of a crown that is far away and mostly leaves us alone. Is that really worth dying for? But Dubois would not be swayed, and neither would his followers. The settlement was fracturing, divided between those who wanted to remain neutral, those who supported the crown, and those who sympathized with the American rebels. And then, in 1779, Spain entered the war on the side of the Americans. Chapter 19. The Spanish Return. The Spanish had never forgotten the Gulf Coast. They had controlled it once, and they wanted it back. In 1779, the young Spanish governor of Louisiana, Bernardo de Galvez, launched a campaign to seize British-held territory. He moved quickly and decisively. Baton Rouge fell, then Natchez, then Mobile. By the spring of 1780, Spanish forces were approaching Isle Dauphine. William received orders to hold the island at all costs. But he had fewer than 30 soldiers, and many of them were sick or wounded. The Spanish had hundreds of troops and several ships. We cannot win this, he told Celeste. I have to surrender, or we will all be killed. Then surrender, she said. There is no shame in it. You have done your duty. But Major Blackwood, who had arrived with reinforcements just days before the Spanish attack, had other ideas. We will fight to the last man, he declared. We will show these Spanish dogs what British soldiers are made of. That is suicide, William protested, and it will get civilians killed. The settlement is right in the line of fire. Then the civilians should leave. This is a military matter. Alexandra, hearing of this exchange, came to the garrison with a delegation of settlement leaders. Major Blackwood, we ask you to surrender. Our families have lived on this island for 70 years. We have survived hurricanes, disease, and pirates. We will not be destroyed because of your pride. Your opinion is noted and dismissed, Blackwood said. Now leave, before I have you arrested for interfering with military operations. That night, William made a decision that would change his life forever. He went to the Spanish lines under a flag of truce and offered to surrender the garrison in exchange for safe passage for the British soldiers and protection for the French settlers. The Spanish commander, Colonel Esteban Rodriguez, agreed immediately. You are a wise man, Captain Ashford, and an honorable one. Your soldiers will be treated as prisoners of war and eventually exchanged. The settlers will be left in peace. When William returned to the garrison and announced his decision, Major Blackwood was apoplectic. You have committed treason. You will hang for this. Perhaps, William said calmly, but everyone will live. That is what matters. The British soldiers laid down their arms the next morning. Major Blackwood was taken away in chains, still ranting about treason and cowardice. William was also taken prisoner, though Colonel Rodriguez treated him with respect. You did the right thing, the colonel told him. You saved lives. That takes more courage than fighting a hopeless battle. Céleste was allowed to visit William in his confinement. She brought their children, Jean-Baptiste, now 12, and Elizabeth, 10, and they clung to their father, crying. What will happen to you? Céleste asked, trying to keep her voice steady. I will be exchanged eventually, sent back to Britain. I will likely face a court-martial for surrendering without a fight. And us? What about us? William took her hands. You must stay here. This is your home, your family's home. I will not ask you to leave it. But I am your wife, and you are also Céleste Mercier, daughter of Alexandre and Isabelle, granddaughter of Jean-Baptiste and Geneviève. You belong here, with your people. You are my people, she said, tears streaming down her face. I know, and I will come back to you, I swear it. Somehow, someday, I will come back. He kissed her, long and deep, not caring that the Spanish guards were watching. Then he kissed his children, holding them close and whispering words of love and encouragement. 3 days later, he was taken away on a Spanish ship, bound for Havana, and eventually for a prisoner exchange. Céleste stood on the beach with her children, watching the ship disappear over the horizon, and felt as if her heart was being torn from her chest. Will Papa come back? Elizabeth asked. Yes, Céleste said, though she was not sure she believed it. Yes, he will come back. But the world was changing too fast, and nothing was certain anymore. Chapter 20. Under Spanish rule. The Spanish proved to be more lenient rulers than the British had been. Colonel Rodriguez, who was appointed military governor of the island, was a practical man who understood that the French settlers were not his enemies. You may keep your language, your religion, your customs, he told them. All we ask is that you swear loyalty to the Spanish crown and pay your taxes. Most of the settlers agreed readily. After all, they had been Spanish subjects before, briefly, in the 1760s, and the Spanish were Catholic, which made them more palatable to the French families than the Protestant British had been. François Dubois, predictably, was not satisfied. We should have fought for independence, he railed. Now we are just trading one master for another. But most people ignored him. They were tired of conflict, tired of uncertainty. They wanted to fish, farm, and raise their children in peace. Alexandre, now 64, was simply grateful that the transition had been relatively bloodless. He had seen too much violence in his life, too much death. He wanted his remaining years to be quiet. Isabelle, at 62, was still strong and vital, though her dark hair was now streaked with silver. She had taken over much of the settlement's healing work from Céleste, who was consumed with worry about William. He will come back, Isabelle told her daughter. He is a survivor. Like all the Mercier men, he will find a way. But months passed, then a year, then 2, and there was no word. Céleste threw herself into work, fishing and trading, raising her children, and helping her aging parents. She refused all suggestions that she might remarry, that she should move on with her life. I am still married, she said firmly, and I will wait for my husband. Young Jean-Baptiste, growing into a strong and serious young man, took on more and more responsibility. He learned Spanish quickly, befriended the garrison soldiers, and became a valuable intermediary between the settlers and the Spanish authorities. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was growing into a beauty. With her mother's dark hair and her father's blue eyes, she was courted by half the young men on the island, both French and Spanish, but she showed no interest in any of them. I want to see the world, she told her mother. Like Papa did. I do not want to spend my whole life on this island. Céleste understood that restlessness. She had felt it herself at that age. But she also knew the dangers of the wider world, the heartbreak it could bring. Be patient, she counseled. Your time will come. In 1782, news reached the island that the war was over. The American colonies had won their independence, and Britain had ceded Florida back to Spain. The Gulf Coast was firmly in Spanish hands now. And still, there was no word of William. Celeste began to lose hope. Perhaps he had died in captivity. Maybe he had been executed for treason. Possibly, he had simply decided to start a new life in Britain, to forget about his French wife and half-breed children. She tried not to think such thoughts, but in the dark hours of the night, they haunted her. Then, in the spring of 1783, a ship arrived from Havana, and William Ashford stepped off it. Chapter 21. Reunion and Renewal. He was thinner than Celeste remembered, his fair hair now streaked with gray, his face lined with hardship. But his blue eyes were the same, and when he saw her standing on the beach, they filled with tears. "Celeste," he said, and his voice broke. She ran to him, and they collided in an embrace that was fierce and desperate and full of years of longing. They kissed as if they could make up for all the lost time in a single moment. And around them, the settlement cheered. "I thought you were dead," Celeste sobbed. "I thought I would never see you again." "I am sorry," he said, holding her face in his hands. "I am so sorry. They kept me in Havana for 2 years, and then there were complications with the exchange, and then I had to face the court-martial in London, and—" "You are here now," she interrupted. "That is all that matters. You are here." Their children, no longer children but young adults, approached cautiously. Jean-Baptiste was 15 now, tall and strong, and Elizabeth was 13, poised on the edge of womanhood. "Papa?" Elizabeth said tentatively. William opened his arms, and they rushed into them, all of them holding each other and crying and laughing at the same time. That night, after the celebration had died down and the children were asleep, William and Celeste lay in bed together, relearning each other's bodies, rediscovering the passion that had never died despite the years apart. "I am not the same man who left," William said afterward, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "The things I saw, the things I endured, they changed me." "I am not the same woman either," Celeste replied. "We have both been through fire, but we survived, and we are together again. That is what matters." "The court-martial found me guilty of dereliction of duty," William said. "I was cashiered from the army, stripped of my rank and pension. I have nothing to offer you now except myself." "That is all I ever wanted," Celeste said. "I do not care about rank or money. I care about you." "I want to stay here," William said, "on the island. I want to make a life here, with you and our children, if the Spanish will allow it." "They will," Celeste assured him. "Colonel Rodriguez is a reasonable man, and you are married to a Mercier. That counts for something here." William smiled. Yes, it does." He was granted permission to stay, and he threw himself into island life with the enthusiasm of a man who had been given a second chance. He learned Spanish, learned to fish, learned the rhythms of the seasons and the tides. He became, in time, more islander than British officer. Alexandre, now in his late 60s, welcomed William back with genuine warmth. "You kept your promise," he said. "You came back to her. That is all I ever asked." Isabel, practical as always, said, "Good. Now we have another pair of hands to help with the work." The years that followed were peaceful ones, relatively speaking. The Spanish rule was light, and the settlement prospered. Trade with Mobile and New Orleans increased. New families arrived, including some Spanish settlers who intermarried with the French. Jean-Baptiste Ashford, as he was known, though he often used his mother's maiden name as much as his father's, grew into a community leader. He was fluent in French, English, and Spanish, and he had inherited his great-grandfather's sense of justice and his grandmother's fierce independence. Elizabeth, meanwhile, did eventually get her wish to see the world. In 1788, at the age of 18, she married a Spanish merchant captain named Diego Alvarez, and sailed away to see the ports of the Caribbean and South America. She returned regularly to visit, bringing exotic gifts and wild stories, and Celeste was both proud and terrified for her adventurous daughter. Alexandre died in 1790, at the age of 74, with Isabel and all his children and grandchildren around him. His last words were, "The island endures. We endure." Isabel followed him 2 years later, at 72, and they were buried side by side on the hill overlooking the Gulf, next to Jean-Baptiste and Geneviève. 4 generations of Mercier now rested in that small cemetery, and their descendants continued to live, love, and struggle on the island they had made their home. But the world was changing again. In Europe, revolution had come to France, and the old order was crumbling. In America, a new nation was growing stronger, pushing westward and eyeing the territories Spain still held. And on Isle Dauphine, a new generation was coming of age, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. Spanish dominion and American destiny. 1793 through 1819. Chapter 22. The New Century. By 1800, Jean-Baptiste Ashford was 32 years old, married to a Spanish woman named Maria Josefa Ramirez, and the father of 4 children. He was the unofficial leader of the island community, respected by the French, Spanish, and the handful of American traders who were beginning to appear with increasing frequency. His eldest son, Alexandre, named for his grandfather, was 12 years old and already showing signs of the Mercier stubbornness and courage. His daughter, Geneviève, was 10, named for her great-great-grandmother, and she had inherited that legendary woman's gift for healing. The younger children, twins named William and Isabel, were 6 and full of mischief. The island had grown over the decades. There were now perhaps 200 people living there permanently, with more coming and going as trade increased. The settlement had a proper church, a school, a market square, and even a small inn for travelers. But tensions were rising. The Spanish Empire was weakening, and everyone knew it. The French had sold Louisiana to the Americans in 1803, though Spain still held Florida and the Gulf Coast. How long that would last was anyone's guess. "The Americans will come eventually," Jean-Baptiste told his wife one evening as they sat on their porch, watching their children play in the fading light. "It is inevitable. They are too ambitious, too hungry for land, to leave us alone forever." Maria Josefa, a practical woman who had been born in Havana and raised in Mobile, nodded. "Then we must be ready. We must teach our children to be flexible, to adapt. That is how the Merciers have always survived, no?" "Yes," Jean-Baptiste agreed. "That is how we survive." But adaptation was about to be tested in ways none of them could have anticipated. Chapter 23. The Smuggler's Return. In the spring of 1805, a ship arrived at the island flying no flag, always a sign of trouble. Jean-Baptiste went down to the harbor to investigate, and what he found made his blood run cold. The ship's captain was a woman in her 30s, dressed in men's clothing, with a cutlass at her hip and a pistol in her belt. She had dark hair streaked with premature gray, and eyes the color of dark honey. She looked exactly like the portraits Jean-Baptiste had seen of his grandmother, Isabel. "I am looking for the Mercier family," the woman said. "I am told they still live on this island." "I am Jean-Baptiste Ashford," he said carefully. "My mother was Céleste Mercier. Who are you?" The woman smiled, and it was a predator's smile. "I am Marguerite Delacroix. My grandmother was Isabelle Mercier, before she married your grandfather. That makes us cousins, I believe." Jean-Baptiste felt the world tilt. He had known, of course, that his grandmother had been the daughter of a pirate, but he had never expected to meet any of that side of the family. "What do you want?" he asked. "Sanctuary," Marguerite said bluntly. "I have been, let us say, engaged in activities that the Spanish authorities do not approve of. I need a place to lay low for a few months, until things cool down." "You are a pirate." "I prefer the term independent merchant, but yes, essentially." Jean-Baptiste should have refused, should have sent her away immediately. But she was family, however distant and disreputable, and the Merciers took care of their own. "You can stay," he said, "but no illegal activities while you are here. No smuggling, no stealing, no violence. This is a peaceful settlement, and I will not have you endangering it." "Agreed," Marguerite said. "You have my word." Her word, as it turned out, was worth about as much as a Confederate dollar. Within a week, Marguerite had charmed half the settlement and scandalized the other half. She taught the children to climb rigging and tie sailors' knots. She drank rum with the men and told outrageous stories of her adventures. She flirted shamelessly with anyone who caught her eye, regardless of gender. And she was smuggling goods through the island, using it as a base for her operations, despite her promise. Jean-Baptiste discovered this when Spanish customs officials arrived, looking for contraband. They searched Marguerite's ship and found nothing because she had already moved the goods to a hidden cache on the island. "You gave me your word," Jean-Baptiste said furiously when he confronted her. "I said I would not endanger the settlement," Marguerite replied calmly. "And I have not. The Spanish found nothing. No one is in trouble. Yet. No one is in trouble yet. But if they discover what you are doing, they will not. I am very good at what I do. This is not a game, Marguerite. This is people's lives, people's homes." For the first time, her cocky expression faltered. "You are right. I am sorry. I will move my operations elsewhere." But before she could, disaster struck. Chapter 24. The Villain. The Spanish customs officials had not given up. They suspected smuggling was occurring and were determined to find proof. Their leader, a man named Captain Rodrigo Salazar, was ambitious and cruel, and he saw the island as a stepping stone to promotion. He began interrogating the islanders, using increasingly harsh methods. When an old fisherman named Pierre Leblanc refused to answer his questions, Salazar had him whipped in the town square. Jean-Baptiste, seeing this, intervened. "Stop this immediately. Pierre is an old man, and he has done nothing wrong." "He is protecting smugglers," Salazar said coldly. "That makes him complicit. He knows nothing about any smuggling. Leave him alone." Salazar turned his cold gaze on Jean-Baptiste. "And what do you know, Senor Ashford? You are the leader here. Surely you must know if illegal activities are occurring." "I know that you are abusing innocent people," Jean-Baptiste said, "and I will report your conduct to the governor in Mobile. Report whatever you like. I have my orders, and I will carry them out." The situation escalated over the following days. Salazar's men searched homes, confiscated property, and arrested anyone they suspected of involvement in smuggling. The settlement was in an uproar, and Jean-Baptiste knew he had to act. He went to Marguerite. "You need to leave. Now. Before this gets any worse." "I am not running," she said. "I will not let these people suffer for my actions." "Then turn yourself in. Confess. And maybe Salazar will leave everyone else alone." "He will not. Men like Salazar do not stop until they have crushed everyone beneath them. No, there is only one way to deal with him." "What do you mean?" Marguerite's smile was cold. "I mean, we fight. We drive him off the island. That is insane. We cannot fight the Spanish army." "We do not have to fight the army, just Salazar and his men. There are only 20 of them, and they are far from reinforcements. If we act quickly and decisively, we can take them by surprise." Jean-Baptiste wanted to refuse, wanted to find a peaceful solution. But he looked at the bruises on old Pierre's back, at the fear in the eyes of the children, at the anger in the faces of the men, and he knew that Marguerite was right. Sometimes, the only answer to tyranny was resistance. "What do you propose?" he asked. Chapter 25. The Battle for the Island. The plan was simple but risky. Marguerite's crew, along with the non-disabled men of the settlement, would attack the Spanish garrison at night when Salazar's men were least prepared. They would capture Salazar and his officers, seize their weapons, and force them to leave the island. "No killing unless absolutely necessary," Jean-Baptiste insisted. "We are not murderers." "Agreed," Marguerite said. "But if they fight back, we defend ourselves. They struck on a moonless night in late summer. Marguerite led the assault, moving through the darkness like a ghost, her crew following with practiced silence. Jean-Baptiste and the settlement men provided support, surrounding the garrison to prevent escape. The Spanish soldiers, caught completely off guard, surrendered quickly. Only Salazar himself resisted, drawing his sword and fighting with desperate fury. It was Marguerite who faced him, her cutlass flashing in the torchlight. They fought across the garrison yard, blade against blade, and it was clear that Marguerite was the superior swordsman. Within minutes, she had disarmed Salazar and held her blade to his throat. "Yield," she said. "Never," he spat. "You are pirates, criminals. You will hang for this." "Perhaps," Marguerite said, "but you will not live to see it." "No!" Jean-Baptiste shouted. "We agreed, no killing." Marguerite looked at him, her face unreadable in the flickering light. Then she lowered her blade. "You are right. He is not worth it." She turned to Salazar. "You and your men will leave this island immediately. You will return to Mobile and report that you found no evidence of smuggling. If you ever come back here, if you ever threaten these people again, I will hunt you down and kill you. Do you understand?" Salazar, his face white with rage and humiliation, nodded. They put the Spanish soldiers on their own ship and watched them sail away into the darkness. When they were gone, the islanders erupted in celebration. But Jean-Baptiste felt no joy, only a profound weariness and the knowledge that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. Marguerite found him standing alone on the beach, watching the horizon where Salazar's ship had disappeared. "You are troubled," she said. "We attacked Spanish soldiers. We threatened a royal officer. There will be consequences. Perhaps, or perhaps, Salazar will be too humiliated to report what happened. Either way, you did what you had to do." She paused. "Your grandfather would be proud." Jean-Baptiste turned to look at her. In the moonlight, she looked younger, less hardened. "Will you stay, now that the danger has passed?" Marguerite was quiet for a long moment. "I am not made for staying, cousin. The sea calls to me, but I will return, from time to time, to check on family. You are always welcome here." She smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her face. "I know, and that means more to me than you can imagine." 3 days later, Marguerite and her crew departed. Jean-Baptiste stood on the wharf with his wife Marie and their children, watching the ship sail away. His daughter Catherine, named for his grandmother, tugged at his hand. "Will we see her again, Papa?" "Yes," Jean-Baptiste said. "I believe we will." And they did, though not as often as they might have wished. Marguerite became something of a legend in the Gulf, a privateer who preyed on British and American shipping during the tensions that followed. She brought gifts when she visited exotic fabrics, strange fruits, tales of distant ports, and the children of Isle Dauphine grew up with stories of their pirate cousin. But Salazar never returned. Whether from shame or fear, he left the island alone, and the Spanish authorities seemed content to ignore the small settlement that caused them no trouble and paid its taxes on time. The years passed. Jean-Baptiste's grandfather, William, died in 1808 at the age of 73, with Céleste holding his hand. She followed him 2 years later, and they were buried side by side in the island cemetery, their graves marked with stones that bore both French and English inscriptions. Jean-Baptiste felt the weight of being the family patriarch now. At 35, he was responsible not just for his own wife and children, but for the extended family that had grown around the Mercier name. His cousin Philippe ran the trading post. His sister Amélie had married a fisherman and had 6 children. The island was full of Merciers and their kin. And then, in 1810, everything began to change again. Chapter 26. The American Girl. The ship that arrived in the spring of 1810 was American, from New Orleans, and carried supplies, mail, and passengers. Among them was a family named Monroe Thomas Monroe, a merchant seeking to establish trade connections in the Gulf, his wife, Sarah, and their daughter, Catherine. Jean-Baptiste's son, Alexandre, just turned 20, was on the wharf when they disembarked. He had inherited his great-great-grandfather's height and his great-great-grandmother's green eyes, and he had grown into a striking young man. He helped the Monroe family with their luggage, and when Catherine Monroe looked up at him with eyes the color of amber, he felt something shift in his chest. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying the soft drawl of Louisiana. "You're very kind." "It is nothing, mademoiselle," Alexandre replied, suddenly aware of how rough his hands must look, how sun-darkened his skin. "Welcome to Isle Dauphine." Catherine Monroe was unlike any girl Alexandra had ever known. She was educated, well-traveled, and utterly unafraid to speak her mind. She wore fashionable, American-style dresses, high-waisted gowns of muslin and silk, with Spencer jackets and bonnets adorned with ribbons. But she was also practical, quick to roll up her sleeves and help when needed. Her father quickly established himself, setting up a warehouse near the wharf and beginning to negotiate with the Spanish authorities for trading rights. Thomas Monroe was a shrewd businessman, but also fair, and the islanders soon came to respect him. Alexandra found excuses to visit the Monroe warehouse almost daily. He would bring fish from the morning catch, or offer to help move heavy crates, or simply stop by to discuss the weather. Catherine seemed amused by his transparent attempts to see her, but she never discouraged him. "You are very persistent, Monsieur Mercier," she said one afternoon, as they sat on the wharf watching the sun set over the Gulf. "Is that a bad thing?" "That depends on your intentions." Alexandre turned to look at her. The setting sun turned her hair to gold and painted her skin with warm light. "My intentions are entirely honorable, mademoiselle. I wish to court you, if you will allow it." Catherine smiled. "I thought you would never ask." Their courtship was the talk of the island. Alexandra was French and Spanish by heritage, Catholic by faith, and deeply rooted in the island's history. Catherine was American and Protestant, a newcomer with no ties to the old ways. Some of the older residents disapproved, but Jean-Baptiste and Marie welcomed Catherine warmly. "Love does not care about nationality," Marie said. "Your great-great-grandmother taught us that." Alexandra took Catherine sailing in his pirogue, showing her the hidden coves and channels that he had known since childhood. They walked on the beach at sunset, talking about everything and nothing, and slowly, carefully, they fell in love. One evening, as they sat together in the garden behind the Mercier house, Catherine turned to Alexandra with a serious expression. "You need to understand something," she said. "My father is not just a merchant. He is also an agent for the American government. They have sent him here to assess the situation, to determine whether the Spanish can hold this territory." Alexandra felt a chill run through him. And what has he determined? That they cannot. The Spanish Empire is crumbling. It is only a matter of time before the Americans take control of this region. She took his hand. "When that happens, there will be conflict. There may be fighting, and you will have to choose which side you are on. I am on the side of my family, my home. That may not be enough. The Americans will expect loyalty, complete loyalty." She looked into his eyes. "I need to know, Alexandra, when the time comes, can you be American? Truly American, not just in name but in your heart?" Alexandra thought about his great-great-grandfather, Jean-Baptiste, who had been French. His great-grandfather, Alexandre, who had adapted to British rule. His grandfather, William, had served the British crown but chose love over duty. His grandmother, Céleste, who had bridged two worlds. His father, Jean-Baptiste, had lived under Spanish rule. "I can be whatever I need to be," he said finally, "as long as I can be with you." Catherine leaned forward and kissed him, soft and sweet at first, then deeper, more urgent. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Then we will face whatever comes together," she whispered. They were married in the fall of 1811, in a ceremony that blended Catholic and Protestant traditions. Father Benoit performed the Catholic rites, and Catherine's mother read from the Protestant Bible. It was unconventional, but it felt right, a union of two worlds, two futures. Their wedding night was spent in the small house, that Alexandra had built for them, overlooking the Gulf. Catherine wore a fine white linen nightgown embroidered with delicate flowers. When Alexandra unlaced it and slipped it from her shoulders, she stood before him unashamed, beautiful in the candlelight. "I love you," he whispered, tracing the curve of her waist, the swell of her breasts. "Show me," she replied, pulling him down onto the bed. They made love with a passion that surprised them both, learning each other's bodies, discovering what brought pleasure and what brought gasps of delight. Afterward, they lay tangled together, talking softly until sleep claimed them, but their happiness was shadowed by the growing tensions around them. The War of 1812 had begun, and the Gulf Coast was becoming a battleground. American forces were pushing south, and the Spanish were struggling to maintain control. And then there was Don Rafael Mendoza. Chapter 27. The Last Tyrant. Mendoza arrived on Isle Dauphine in the spring of 1812, sent by the Spanish authorities to strengthen their hold on the island and prevent it from falling to the Americans. He was a colonel in the Spanish army, a man in his 40s with cold eyes and a reputation for brutality. He immediately began making changes. He increased taxes, imposed new regulations, and demanded that all trade go through official Spanish channels. He also took an unhealthy interest in the island's women, particularly the younger ones. When he saw Catherine Monroe, now Catherine Mercier, he became obsessed. He would find excuses to visit the Mercier household, bringing gifts that Catherine refused and making comments that bordered on the inappropriate. "Your wife is very beautiful," he said to Alexandra one day, his tone making it clear that this was not a compliment but a threat. "You are a lucky man. I hope you appreciate what you have." "I do," Alexandra said, keeping his voice level despite the rage building inside him. "And I protect what is mine." Of course, Mendoza smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I meant no offense." But the harassment continued. Mendoza would accidentally encounter Catherine when she was alone, would stand too close, and would let his gaze linger too long. Catherine handled it with grace and firmness, but Alexandra could see the strain it was putting on her. "We should leave," he said one night. "Go to Mobile or New Orleans, somewhere he cannot reach you." "No," Catherine said firmly. "This is our home. A bully will not drive me away. Then I will kill him." "And be hanged for murder?" "No, Alexandre. We will find another way." The situation came to a head in the summer of 1812. Mendoza arrested Jean-Baptiste on trumped-up charges of sedition, claiming that he had been in contact with American agents. It was partially true. Thomas Monroe had indeed been gathering intelligence, but Jean-Baptiste had done nothing illegal. "Release him," Alexandra demanded, confronting Mendoza at the garrison. "I think not. Your father is a traitor to the Spanish crown. He will be tried and, if found guilty, executed." "On what evidence?" "On my word. That is all the evidence I need." Alexandre knew he was beaten. Mendoza had the power of the Spanish government behind him, and there was nothing Alexandre could do through official channels. But Catherine, raised in the rough-and-tumble world of New Orleans politics, had learned that sometimes the only way to fight corruption was with cunning. She went to her father, and together they hatched a plan. Thomas Monroe sent word to the American forces that were gathering to the north. He told them that the Spanish garrison on Isle Dauphine was weak, that the population was sympathetic to the American cause, and that the island could be taken with minimal bloodshed. He also told them to hurry, because an innocent man's life was at stake. Chapter 28. The Reckoning. What Thomas Monroe did not tell the American forces was that he planned to act before they arrived. He could not risk waiting, not with Jean-Baptiste's life hanging in the balance. He gathered the island's men, fishermen, traders, farmers, and armed them with whatever weapons they could find. It was not much of a force, but it would have to be enough. "We are not soldiers," one of the men said nervously. "We cannot fight trained troops." "We do not have to fight them," Monroe replied. "We just have to hold them long enough for help to arrive." Alexandre was skeptical. "And if help does not arrive in time?" Then we improvise. They struck at dawn, surrounding the garrison and demanding Jean-Baptiste's release. Mendoza, caught off guard, barricaded himself inside with his soldiers. "You are committing treason!" he shouted from a window. "The Spanish crown will crush you for this." "The Spanish crown is 1,000 miles away," Monroe shouted back, "and it is falling apart. You have no power here anymore, Mendoza. Release Jean-Baptiste and leave this island, and we will let you go in peace." Never. The standoff lasted for 2 days. The islanders surrounded the garrison, preventing anyone from entering or leaving. Mendoza's soldiers, seeing that they were outnumbered and that the population was against them, began to lose their nerve. On the 3rd day, Catherine took matters into her own hands. She had been watching Mendoza, studying his patterns, and she had noticed that he had a weakness for brandy. She sent him a bottle, claiming it was a peace offering, a gesture of goodwill. Mendoza, suspicious but also arrogant, drank it. The brandy was laced with laudanum, enough to make him drowsy, but not enough to kill him. When he fell asleep, Catherine slipped into the garrison through a window that she had noticed was poorly secured. She found her father-in-law in a cell, bruised but alive. "Catherine, what are you doing here?" "Rescuing you." "Can you walk?" "I think so." They made their way out of the garrison, moving quietly through the darkened corridors. They were almost to the door when a soldier spotted them and raised the alarm. Alexandre, hearing the commotion, led a group of men in a rush on the garrison. They broke through the doors and fought hand to hand with the Spanish soldiers. It was brutal and chaotic, but the islanders had the advantage of numbers and desperation. Mendoza, waking from his drugged sleep, tried to rally his men, but it was too late. The garrison was overrun, and his soldiers were surrendering. "This is not over," Mendoza screamed at Alexandra. "The Spanish government will send more troops. They will burn this island to the ground." "The Spanish government has more important things to worry about," Alexandra replied, "like the American army that is marching toward Mobile as we speak." Mendoza's face went white. "What are you talking about? Did you really think we would act without a plan? The Americans are coming, Mendoza. They will be here within days, and when they arrive, they will find that Isle Dauphine has already declared for the United States." It was a bluff. The American forces were still weeks away, but Mendoza did not know that. He looked around at his defeated soldiers, at the hostile faces of the islanders, and he realized that he had lost. "You will regret this," he said. "Perhaps," Alexandra replied, "but you will not be here to see it." They put Mendoza and his soldiers on a ship and sent them back to Mobile. As the vessel disappeared over the horizon, Alexandra felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "It is done," he said. "For now," his father replied, "but the real test is still to come." Jean-Baptiste was right. When the American forces finally arrived in April of 1813, led by General James Wilkinson, they found an island that was ready to welcome them, but also wary of what American rule might mean. Wilkinson was a pragmatic man. He saw that the islanders were willing to cooperate, and he had no desire to antagonize them unnecessarily. He raised the American flag over the island, administered oaths of loyalty, and promised that those who swore allegiance to the United States would be protected and treated fairly. Most of the islanders took the oath without hesitation. They had lived under French, British, and Spanish rule. One more flag made little difference. What mattered was survival, family, and the ability to live their lives in peace. Alexandre stood with his father and grandfather as they swore their oaths. He thought about all the generations that had come before, all the times the Mercier family had adapted to new rulers, new laws, new ways of life. "We endure," Jean-Baptiste murmured, as if reading his son's thoughts. "That is what we do." Chapter 29. The Circle Complete. In the months that followed, Isle Dauphine slowly adjusted to American rule. The changes were less dramatic than some had feared. English became the official language, but French and Spanish were still spoken in homes and on the streets. American laws replaced Spanish ones, but the basic rhythms of island life continued much as before. Catherine gave birth to their first child in the fall of 813, a daughter they named Geneviève, after Alexandra's great-great-grandmother. When Jean-Baptiste held his granddaughter for the first time, tears streamed down his weathered face. "She has her eyes," he whispered. "The same green eyes. Tell me about her," Alexandra said. "Tell me about the first Geneviève." And so Jean-Baptiste told the story, as his father had told it to him, and his grandfather before that. He spoke of Jean-Baptiste Mercier and Geneviève Rousseau, of their love and their courage, of how they had built a life on this island when it was the capital of Louisiana. He told of the hurricane of 1717, of the struggles and the triumphs, of all the generations that had followed. "They would be proud," Jean-Baptiste said, "all of them, to see what we have become, what we have built." That winter, they held a celebration not for any particular holiday, but simply to mark the fact that they had survived, that they were still here. The entire island gathered, Merciers and Monroes, and all the other families that had made Isle Dauphine their home. They roasted a pig over an open fire, and there was fresh fish and oysters, bread and vegetables from the gardens, and wine that Thomas Monroe had brought from New Orleans. They danced to fiddle music, the old French contradances mixing with American reels, and the children ran wild on the beach. Alexandre stood with Catherine, watching the celebration, their daughter asleep in Catherine's arms. "Are you happy?" Catherine asked. "I am exactly where I want to be," Alexandra replied. As the sun set over the gulf, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Jean-Baptiste gathered the family together. He was 78 now, his hair white, his body bent with age, but his mind was still sharp. "I want to tell you all something," he said. "I am the last of my generation. My cousins are gone. My siblings are gone. Soon, I will join them. But before I do, I want you to understand what this family represents." He gestured toward the island, toward the people gathered around them. "For over a century, the Merciers have lived on this island. We have survived hurricanes and wars, disease and hardship. We have lived under 4 different flags and sworn loyalty to 4 different nations. And through it all, we have endured." He looked at Alexandre, at Catherine, at the baby in her arms. "You are the future now, you and your children, and your children's children. The world will continue to change. There will be new challenges, new struggles. But as long as you remember who you are, as long as you hold fast to family and honor and love, you will survive, just as we have survived." There was silence for a moment, and then someone began to clap. Others joined in, and soon the entire gathering was applauding, not just for Jean-Baptiste, but for all the Merciers who had come before, for the legacy they had built. That night, after the celebration had ended and the guests had gone home, Alexandra walked down to the beach. The moon was full, casting a silver path across the water, and he could hear the gentle lap of waves against the shore. He thought about his great-great-grandfather, standing on this same beach over a century ago, watching the ships come and go from the harbor. He thought about all the lives that had been lived here, all the loves and losses, all the moments of joy and sorrow. Catherine joined him, slipping her hand into his. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About how much has changed, and how much has stayed the same. The island endures." "Yes, and so do we." They stood together in the moonlight, watching the waves, and Alexandra felt a profound sense of peace. This was his home, his heritage, his legacy. And whatever the future might bring, he knew that the Merciers would face it together, as they always had. Because that was what they did. That was who they were. The tides would rise and fall. Storms would come and go. Flags would change, and nations would rise and fall. But Isle Dauphine would remain, and so would the family that had made it their home. Jean-Baptiste Mercier died in his sleep in the spring of 1815 at the age of 80. They buried him next to his wife, Marie, in the cemetery where so many Merciers rested. The entire island attended the funeral, and Father Benoit himself, nearly 80, spoke of the Mercier family's legacy. "For over a century," he said, This family has been the heart of Isle Dauphine. They have led with wisdom, loved with passion, and endured with courage. Jean-Baptiste was the last link to that first generation, to the days when this island was the capital of Louisiana. Now that the link is broken, the chain continues. The story goes on. After the funeral, Alexandre stood at his father's grave, Catherine beside him, their daughter in his arms. He thought about the weight of history, the burden of legacy, and the responsibility of carrying it forward. "I will make you proud, Papa," he whispered. "I promise." And he did. Alexandre Mercier became a leader in the new American territory, serving on the council that governed the island, helping to build schools and churches, working to preserve the French heritage even as they embraced their American future. He and Catherine had 5 more children, 3 sons and 2 daughters, and they raised them to be proud of their mixed heritage, to honor the past while looking toward the future. The island continued to change. More Americans arrived, bringing new ideas and new ways of doing things. The old French families gradually intermarried with the newcomers, creating a unique culture that was neither entirely French nor fully American, but something distinctly its own. But through it all, the Mercier family remained. They adapted, as they always had. They survived, as they always had. And they thrived, building on the foundation that Jean-Baptiste and Geneviève had laid so many years before. Years later, when Alexandre was an old man himself, he would take his grandchildren down to the beach and tell them stories of their ancestors. He would point to the place where the old French fort had stood, where the first Jean-Baptiste had watched for smugglers and pirates. He would show them the cemetery where generations of Merciers were buried, each stone a testament to a life lived, a story told. "Remember," he would tell them, "you come from a long line of survivors. Your ancestors faced impossible odds and overcame them. They loved deeply, fought bravely, and never gave up. That is your heritage. That is who you are." And the children would listen, wide-eyed, and they would understand that they were part of something larger than themselves, something that stretched back through time and would continue long after they were gone. The story of Isle Dauphine and of the Mercier family was far from over. It would continue through the years of Alabama statehood, through the Civil War and Reconstruction, through the 20th century, and beyond. There would be more challenges, more changes, more moments of triumph and tragedy. But the island would endure, and so would the family that had made it their home. Because some things are stronger than storms, more enduring than empires, more potent than the passage of time. Love, family, home. These are the things that last. These are the things that matter. And on a small barrier island in the Gulf of Mexico, where the tides rise and fall with ancient rhythm, where the wind carries the scent of salt and pine, where the ghosts of the past walk beside the living, the Mercier family would always be there, watching, waiting, enduring, as they always had, as they always would. The end.